The Colosseum in Rome, the originator of all stadiums modern, or so we're told if we go off the official historical account. When we look at the arches and the magnificent construction that the Romans achieved nearly 2,000 years ago, using advanced concrete, volcanic ash, and other processes that somehow managed to endure for 2,000 years, we have to realize that this particular stadium or Colosseum was constructed at a time right after a civil war. And as we found out in our recent explorations, the best time to build magnificent architecture is right after a civil war. The very best time is right after a civil war during a great economic upheaval, or a depression. Come, let's begin our exploration of stadiums. We start with Yankee Stadium, broke ground May 5, 1922, and opened April 18, 1923, less than a year later. What an elaborate structure that they managed to construct in the early 20th century, right after the end of World War I. Of course, the economic conditions did support it because this was the Roaring '20s. And we see that they managed to erect an incredible stadium, and they did it in a very short amount of time. Yankee Stadium is famous, especially if you're Yankees fan, or whether you're a baseball fan or not. Yet we see many of the same construction hallmarks that we see in more advanced stadiums, all within a year. How exactly was it they managed to achieve this? It's also interesting when you consider the fact that the three major sports that have the most spectators, and I'm not judging sports in the United States, have been baseball, basketball, and football. All sports that we're told, according to the official historical account, did not exist before 1850. Quite an interesting consideration. Looking at the construction of Yankee Stadium, we can see some rather advanced form of concrete, and when we look closer at it, despite the fact that these are photos that were taken in the 1920s and 1930s, this concrete already looks rather aged. And of course, there's a simple explanation. They were burning a lot of coal at that time. They hadn't converted coal to other energy production capabilities, and that's why it looks stained already, despite being relatively new. Nevertheless, interesting photos that we see after its inception. And we'll be told that the incredible construction was achieved at the behest of Edison Portland Cement Co. And it wasn't a profitable business until they got this contract to build Yankee Stadium. Very interesting. So it wasn't enough for Edison to be involved in electricity and film. He also had to be involved in his own cement company, because why not? And of course, the processes behind this. I wonder, though, if Yankee Stadium has slightly more advanced concrete than what we're told, because the construction of Yankee Stadium seems a little bit beyond Portland cement. With adjustments for inflation, we'll be told that construction costs originally were $34 million, and then the renovations, when adjusted for inflation, cost $859 million. How exactly do you explain this tenfold increase in cost to build to renovate? And is this the original concrete, or did they change it, as we have all these accounts of these structures being constantly renovated, especially in the 1970s if they weren't torn down? It's a fascinating consideration to me, though, that it costs so much more to renovate this structure than to build it. Is it simply because they didn't have OSHA in the 1920s? Is it because Edison's construction techniques were just that advanced, and his Portland cement was just that great that they were able to construct it very cheaply and very quickly? It's another indication that technology has diminished in the 21st century, and certainly in the mid to latter 20th century. Perhaps they didn't have an economic depression, or they just didn't have another civil war. When you look at Yankee Stadium, you get the impression of more elaborate architecture, something that seems to be quite beyond the successor that they built, as unfortunately they did tear this original stadium down. It seems to be something that hints at a different purpose for what this stadium originally was. And when we look at the photos, it again hints that there's more to the story than meets the eye. Yankee Stadium was famous. The Yankees as a baseball team are famous, and many consider them America's team. It's in the name, and of course it's in the performance, at least the perceived performance. However, Yankee Stadium was not to survive. Despite all the money that was put into the renovation, which vastly exceeded the original construction, it was only going to be around for about 30 more years. The legends that accompany these stadiums almost seem to go beyond the original intention of their construction. And what were they really trying to achieve when they built them? Well, it took 20 months to destroy and only 11.5 months to build once they tore it down in the late 2000s. Not quite 2 years, but almost 2 years. So what's this tell us?
As a matter of cosmic history, it has always been easier to destroy than to create.
Not anymore. Now we can do both at the same time.
There seems to be much more to this story than meets the eye. It seems as though it was very difficult to tear down this incredible stadium. And why did it take them so long? This was the 21st century. We had all implements of modern technology available. Yet despite this building and the legends associated with it, we're told that it was no longer suitable to host the games of the New York Yankees. So they had to tear it down, unfortunately. And it seems as though it was a difficult and time-consuming process, which of course will explain because we have OSHA standards in place, and while we may have modern equipment, we have to be very safe about it. And here you can actually see the two stadiums standing next to each other as they built the new one while they were tearing down the old one. It's almost as though someone's trying to obfuscate the account of the existence of Yankee Stadium. And here is the modern beauty that we have now. And if you go back and compare it to the original one, you can see that there is really no comparison. Isn't it very interesting? And now we go to Chicago Stadium, built in 1929 and tore down in 1995. And this hosted the Chicago hockey team and, of course, the famous Chicago Bulls basketball team. And we can see that this almost has Art Deco stylings to it, with great artistic impressions and reliefs on the exterior of the building. Quite interesting for a sports venue. Well, it was the 1920s, so of course we were going to build a building that had artistic impressions on it. We seemed to care to actually do such things back then. Let's take a closer look at this Chicago Stadium. Interesting figures that we have on the outside of it. And the typical explanation will be, well, this is what we afforded for Art Deco, that we needed to put impressions and reliefs on the exterior of the building. No doubt this would inspire the local sports teams to perform better. Very beautiful impressions here. And yet, does this really reflect what we would seem as those who play basketball or those who play hockey? I mean, we're told they're the same sports in the 1920s. Were they really that different? The interior is no less impressive. And of course, here we see everyone seated around the hockey rink as they're excited, waiting for another game to start. Quite a lot of history associated with Chicago. And yet there's even more to this building when we consider the organ that they had established within the building, a Barton organ. You see, it's quite an amazing device, and they even decorate this organ artistically. What's really the story behind this? This is yet another example, though, of an older structure that seems to rely on sound. Apparently, this organ managed to generate a lot of sound during the games and provide additional entertainment. Of course, it should be noted that the organ player, or the artist, was in grave physical danger, especially when they decided to hold one of the very first NFL playoff games in the Chicago Stadium. Still, this device is very interesting, and it shows a rather fascinating construction in and of itself. It's almost as though there was a different focus in this time frame, where we sought these buildings to provide and project sound. Well, they used the Chicago Stadium for the 1932 NFL playoff between the Bears and the Portsmouth Spartans, and they had to shorten the field to 60 yards and agree that there were no field goals. What an interesting game to play for the first NFL playoff game in an indoor stadium. We'll be told that because the conditions were so difficult in the outdoors in Chicago at the time, this is why they had to move this football game for an indoor stadium that wasn't at the right size to accommodate it. And it should also be noted that the organ player was hit by a punt that went errant, or at least a kick. This is Portsmouth, Ohio, and this is a picture of it from the 1884 flood. It should be noted that the Portsmouth Spartans eventually became the Detroit Lions. Well, is this a construction photo? Is this a deconstruction photo? This is supposedly a construction photo from the 1920s. However, compare the Chicago Stadium in its destruction photos when they tore it down in the 1990s, and if you convert it to black and white, isn't it interesting how it becomes very obfuscated to tell exactly what's happening? And here you see a colored photo of when they tore this down. Yet another example of a stadium that they decided to tear down while they built the next stadium right next to it. And we see that with the current existing United Center, which is where the Chicago Bulls play. Always fascinating to see these two structures right next to each other and compare and contrast them. Naturally, I didn't let the situation endure, but here we have our little memorial in the Portland cement to the old Chicago Stadium. Yes, that's definitely Portland cement. You can tell when you have all those little cracks in it. Compare and contrast that to the other cement. And now we go to Soldier Field, built 1922 to 1924, the world's largest stadium. And we're still in Chicago. Yes, this is the kind of stadium that you need, with very large Roman Forum buildings that are built on it. And we have some very convincing construction photos that go along with it. Of course, we'll be told that this is neoclassical construction, and everybody was really into this in the 1920s. If you're going to build a large football stadium, the world's largest at the time, then you're going to make sure that it resembles Rome, because remember, this connects back to the Colosseum. This also followed a global conflict, World War I. Now, it's not a civil war, and they didn't have a depression since the 1920s, but they were still quite focused on establishing a great structure that matched or exceeded the Colosseum in Rome, because nobody could ever let go of that idea. Some of these construction photos are very questionable when we look at them, and we're not exactly sure what's going on. It almost looks as though they are cleaning the structure more than actually building it. Not that I mean to ask those questions, I'm just making observations. I suppose the stands look a little bit newer here, but do they really look newer? And what's really going on in some of the background on this photo? Hard to tell. Once they had the stadium built, or the field built, you can see that many games and different athletic contests were held under the oversight of these great forum structures. Yes, there's nothing more American than practicing football under what looks to be the Roman Forum up on the stands with the columns, and yes, of course, our favorite pediments. Soldier Field has a long and storied history with it, and it's interesting how this was considered the very grace of America in the 1920s and beyond, with the establishment of these structures. And in all these original photos, you almost get the impression that you're really not in the United States, but you're transported to a different place in a different time. I'm sure that's just a coincidence. It should also be noted that they converted Soldier Field to use for a long jump, a ski jump, and many other sporting events. And that actually makes a perfect purpose. That's why you would build forum buildings such as that. Yet in all these early photographs, we have these hints that there was something much greater with this field. Perhaps it had an entirely different purpose than the mere spectator sporting events that were held at it for decades on end. It's intriguing to consider the fact that such a field for sporting events has endured for so long, and you can even see in some of the forum structures the same construction in the ceilings that we noted in the Parthenon in Nashville, Tennessee. Very interesting. And of course, they've renovated this field as well as they did the other stadiums that we looked at, and this one occurred in the 2000s. And it gives you a little bit of an idea as to how advanced the construction is. Of course, now what they've done is they've prevented the audience and the cameras of the current games to really see the forum structures. Very interesting. Neoclassical structures that were very important to build, but now you don't highlight or showcase them anymore. They seem to be holding up quite well, and I could even say that this compares with the aesthetic beauty that we see in such structures as the Parthenon in Nashville, Tennessee. So why wouldn't you showcase this in a football game? Because as you can see, the stadium is now bowled in, where they've moved the seating, and it's quite possible that someone attending a game wouldn't even notice these structures. And it's certain to say that if you watch a Bears game now, as the Chicago Bears play at this field, you're not going to notice these structures either. I wonder why that would be. Why would they devote the resources into erecting such structures but then not wish to showcase them? They still look very beautiful and clean and aesthetically pleasing, but I guess we just don't need them anymore. We've moved on. This is the 21st century. Unfortunately, Soldier Field's days may be numbered, as there is a plan, or at least a concept, to build a new stadium in Arlington Heights, in the, how shall we say, more well-to-do area about Chicago. And this is what that concept could look like. Naturally, they have other buildings with other purposes, and we can see how these new conceptualized buildings compare with other buildings that we've looked at before. Well, now we move on to Busch Stadium, Indianapolis, an Art Deco baseball field built in 1931. Another interesting consideration to look at the Art Deco aspect in the entryway into the field. And this is not something that we really see a lot of, and I have to admit, I was not aware that there was ever a stadium that was built in the Art Deco style directly. Of course, we saw other ones that looked like Art Deco style, but I'm sure it's merely a matter of perception, and I'm not going to say designation. However, this field seemed to host many games, and you need to have an Art Deco field if you're going to have the best performing team. Despite the historical connotations and importance with this field in Indianapolis, it's been converted into stadium lofts, and this shouldn't be confused with Busch Stadium with a C in St. Louis. And we can see that it's now been converted into apartments, so I suppose it's inspiring that the buildings managed to survive. However, considering the fact that it's now been reduced to lofts, it makes one question what its original purpose truly was. And now we go to Harvard Stadium, broke ground July 1903 and opened November 14th, 1903, as a National Historical Landmark in 1987 because of its pioneering use of reinforced concrete. Once again, a very short construction time, but this is Harvard, considered the leading secondary academic institution in the United States, and no doubt one of the greatest universities in the United States. As this stadium was designed and built by graduates, of course it's only the finest stadium, and it's holding up quite well to this day. And we have many hints of the Roman Colosseum in this Harvard Stadium, and we're even told that it inspired all the great college football stadiums to follow in the United States. You can see with its great arches that this is certainly not a slouch. It's a very impressive stadium, and it stands to this day. Reinforced concrete that also just happened to have ivy growing on the outside of it, and they even had to have programs to remove the ivy. Interesting when we consider the fact that they used reinforced concrete, and this was supposedly experimental at the time. Oh, yes, apparently they just did temporary forum-type buildings to hold Greek tragedy plays in the stadium as well. Oh, very fitting, and we know how proficient they were at building temporary structures in the early 20th century. Here's some of the construction photos of the Harvard Stadium. And once again, we see a curious lack of individuals, but perhaps it was just a day off. And despite the aggressive construction timeline, it's clear they had a very good plan behind it. And because of the genius-level intellect and the execution that no doubt went into the planning of the stadium, they were able to erect it in a record amount of time. Certainly a time frame we could never replicate today. But that's because we have OSHA, and it's the 21st century, and I doubt we're going to see a civil war, no matter how much we're threatened at the prospect of it. Very unique photos, and isn't it interesting when you look at this dedication and the inscription here and how it contrasts with the concrete around it. Once again, I'm wondering if that indicates that the concrete, it appears to be a different kind of concrete. It certainly does not appear to be Portland cement. And is it really reinforced? This is definitely a structure I would like to examine in person and see what the nature of the concrete is. And here you can even see it in the column, and while there may be a small crack in it, how old is that column really? And how old is this ledge? This reminds me of the concrete that I see in many of the old forts in Louisiana that have been around since the early 19th century. Stadium is holding up quite well, and to this day it still hosts the Harvard football team games, and it looks like it does a very commendable job at that. It's also interesting when you consider the fact that those are all columns that you're seeing in your immediate field of view towards the top of this image. And then the stands as well. And even the entry doorways and all the other details that went into the construction of this remarkable stadium. And I'd even say that the stadium classifies as extraordinary because of the fact that it's still standing to this day. Yes, we even have an image of John F. Kennedy attending a game. And what's interesting about this image, beyond the attendance of the president, is you can see the columns in the background and just how detailed that they are. So many columns, all in a football stadium. And this had the notoriety of being the largest concrete stadium until Archbold Stadium broke ground May 1905, built August 20th, 1906, and this is at Syracuse University. And this is where they hosted their football games. And apparently their football team had a very incredible record when they played at this particular venue. And when you look at this one, you get a very different imaging. It's almost as though they combined Castle Grayskull revival style and perhaps fantasy Lord of the Rings revival style when you look at some of these structures. Yes, here you go with the large gate entryway. Now, I'm not going to say it resembles a castle, but the parapets are quite an interesting touch above the large arched entryway. Well, now you can see why their football team was so dominant. No doubt that they were inspired when they saw that they were playing in such an elaborate venue. And yet you can see in these photos that this was quite a real stadium, and it existed. It's unfortunate that this stadium did not survive in the same way that the Harvard Stadium did. It seems as though the United States, we had this desired effort to make everything new again from the 1950s to the 1970s. You'd almost think that the Cold War and the post-World War II period just wasn't quite as beneficial towards the advancement of architecture in the United States. It's also interesting looking at some of the other buildings in Syracuse. We see this very unique domed building right next to the stadium. We'll have to take a closer look at these universities, and there will be a university exploration coming. This is just, again, otherworldly when we see these buildings and these stands in this kind of stadium from the early 20th century. It's incredible to think that these are the same sports and these are the same stadiums motivated by the original Colosseum in Rome, and yet you almost get the impression of a completely different form of existence at that time when you see this parapeted entryway over an arch into Archibald Stadium. Ah, I see how it all fits together. And I'm sure you can see the joke in that as well. Or maybe not. And now we go to Ohio Stadium. Broke ground August 3rd, 1921 and opened October 7th, 1922. The Ohio State University. Supposedly, this design was inspired by the great design of the Harvard Stadium, and they've called it the Horseshoe. And we can see that they've modernized and renovated this stadium as well. I mean, look, this is the Ohio State. They consider themselves the greatest football team in American college football history. Interesting construction photo here where we see that they're establishing the framework. And no doubt they'll tell us that's how they conducted the reinforced concrete construction behind Ohio Stadium for the Ohio State University. And here you can see, as they're continuing the construction, once again a very interesting photo and a lot of details on it. I don't know why, but there almost seems to be something a little off with the scale, and perhaps it was just because of the limitations of photography at the time. And you see that as they're building the stands, you get the impression that there's something else going on. And I'm certainly not debating or doubting the incredible stature of this stadium, and I'm certainly not debating the success of the Ohio State football team. It should be noted that this stadium, with all the modifications done on it, eventually seated over 100,000 people, as it does to this day. Look, this is the Ohio State. You need a lot of capacity. However, I don't see capacity as one of the real questioning points with these stadiums. What I see, though, is the rapidity of construction, the seeming ease of construction, and of course always going back to the old reasons for why we could do this so easily in the early 20th century is because we didn't have OSHA, we didn't have safety standards, and we had lots of skilled laborers who were willing to work or they died. Or in the case of Yankee Stadium, you had somebody like Thomas Edison who was just going around with his Portland Cement Company. And yet they could build incredible stadiums like this that endure to this day. And we can see that Ohio Stadium has hosted many wondrous events over the years, and they've kept track of their history quite well at The Ohio State University. The question you'll no doubt ask, though, is what was the original purpose behind these stadiums, if these were indeed pre-existing structures that weren't built, as we were told, but were merely cleaned up and restored, as both the construction timelines and the financial resources that were devoted to them seem to indicate. Well, there's a lot of theories in terms of what these structures could have originally been used for. One of my favorite viewer comments suggested, did they play football back in the day? And to answer that, I'll say, no, Chassis, I don't think they played Tartarian football. However, I believe that these structures had a very different purpose than for the hosting of sporting venues. Perhaps they were some form of technology, power generation, or even power collection and distribution. We don't really have a great idea of what the exact technologies of the civilization that preceded ours truly were. We'll be told ad nauseum that the abilities of the past were simply due to people's willingness to work a lot harder. And even looking at some of the images that we have of this incredible stadium that endures in Columbus, Ohio to this day, we're given different impressions as to how this wondrous structure was used as a sporting venue, and yet nobody really paid attention to the structure itself. Everybody always paid attention to the team and the actual event. And yet, when you look at the numerous renovations, you do see certain aspects that hint back to the original Roman Colosseum that we saw. Ohio State is interesting because we also looked at this armory building from the 19th century that existed there. I'm not going to say it looks like a castle because I don't think I have to. Maybe you think it looks like something else? Not Castle Grayskull, certainly. And unfortunately, this structure disappeared in a fire in the 1950s. Well, it was damaged by fire and they had to tear it down. Or so they tell us. So going back to the original Colosseum, what exactly were these structures used for? And as I stated, I believe that these originally represented some sort of power generation, especially when you look at the Colosseum in Rome. And you do have the hints to more elaborate construction in the older stadiums in the United States as well. So this gives us an indication that these were structures that were used for many different purposes. They just happened to be able to be converted to hosting large groups of people. But let me ask you, if you're sitting up in the upper stands of the Colosseum, how well could you really see these large gladiatorial battles that supposedly occurred? How well can you see a football game in the upper stands? Well, thanks for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel, and today we're going to be examining lost technology of the old world. And our exploration today takes us to Southeast Asia. We're going to be examining some of the stunning temples and temple complexes that we have. Isn't it interesting how we always tend to call things temples or tombs, especially when we're referring to anything outside of what we consider the so-called Western world, or when we're looking in the distant past? It's as though people in the past had nothing better to do, so they were simply going to build temples and tombs. And it's a little bit of a way of referring to the fact that many of these accounts that we have for these stunning structures seem to simply be hand-waved accounts. We don't really have a good explanation, we can't really contrive a good historical account, so we're simply going to say that it's a temple, it's a religious structure, or it's a tomb, which serves religious purposes as well, but we decided to devote a lot of time to it. And isn't it funny how that seems to be the go-to explanation for many of these stunning structures, which we certainly know we couldn't construct today. For example, here in Angkor Wat, we have a tower that could possibly be related to power generation. Or does it have other possibilities for what the original purpose of this structure really was? When we look on the ground, we see a very unique and stunning appearance of construction materials that we have no idea how long they've been there, and what was the exact process used to construct this very unique temple complex. We're going to examine these, and we're also going to try to posit some theories for what the real purpose of these buildings were beyond just simply being towers and tombs. And our first exploration takes us to Wat Arun in Bangkok, Thailand. And we can see that Bangkok is a very complex city, and it's certainly one worthy of a full city exploration, and will be coming in the following months when we move to Southeast Asia. But for right now, we're staying focused on the temple of Wat Arun, which just happens to be right off the major river running through the center of Bangkok. And we also have an exploration concerning rivers as well, because they're rather interesting. We see the main prang or tower surrounded by several smaller prangs, and getting on the ground we can see that this temple is extremely advanced in its construction. We can see that this main tower has construction techniques in it in methods that we couldn't easily replicate today, even if we were building a small model of it. That's maybe 1/100th scale. And of course people will tell us it's because back in Thailand in the day they worked harder, they didn't have safety standards. And yes, I know we go over that many times. But even looking at the approach to the temple, we can see advanced construction techniques. And we'll be told that this is a Buddhist temple, and that it's because of the devotion to the study of Buddhism that's what facilitated the construction of this temple. That's always the explanation. And yet the main prang and some of the subsidiary architecture is very impressive, as we have many surrounding and smaller towers, which gives the impression that there was a completely different purpose behind this temple, and really this is a temple complex itself, even though they just say it's a temple. And what was its original purpose? Was it for power generation? Was it designed to contribute to the spirit of the people? Wat Arun, Temple of the Dawn, it's Buddhist. We're told it was founded in 1656, but then the main prang was built during the 19th century? Why is it everything was constructed in the 19th century? And even in Southeast Asia, we can't escape that particular narrative tone. And yes, I am going to say the word narrative because that's what it is. It's as though the entire world was built in the 19th century. Now, they don't exactly know when this original temple was built. They just say it's always sort of been there. But let us assure you that the main prang was constructed in the 19th century, because when else would it be constructed? Looking, though, at some of the details, we see something that reflects of a long-gone past glory with this particular temple. We see more of a natural construction technique, and by natural, something that appears a lot more organic. There's something much more than what we'll see in our favorite architectural stylings of brutalist. No, nobody was thinking of brutalist here in the 19th century when they constructed this. And interestingly enough, this particular temple has been renovated as well, so once again it appears as though they're obfuscating the account. But you can appreciate and see the great beauty in the architectural detailing. How exactly did they do all this? Are we to believe that a veritable army of thousands descended upon this site to find, chisel, and carve out all of these impressive figures and all of these beautiful works of natural art, and that they spent years and years doing so? Or in the 19th century when they made this temple? What's interesting, though, is that the main prang, what's interesting, though, is that the subsidiary temples, or the subsidiary prangs and towers, have the exact same appearance to them as the main tower. So stepping outside the box here, and stepping outside what our given historical account is, I'm speculating on what the real purpose of this temple really was. And we see something that could have been anything from power generation to perhaps a gathering place to restore the spiritual health of the people at the time. I think there's a reason why many of these surviving structures from the old world tend to be labeled as religious structures, because they do seem to have a little bit of a religious or a spiritual effect to them. But if we go back to what their original intended purpose was, if they were designed to reinvigorate the spirit within the individual, because we speculate that in the past civilization there was a balance between the individual and the society that they lived in, then the real function of religion and spirituality in that society was to also reinvigorate the individual. Now, we're told that continues to this day in our major religions, and yes, you can still find that. But I'm not wondering if that's a nice little parallel that happens to continue with all these structures. And I believe that when you look at the beauty of this particular prang or main tower here in Bangkok, you can see a lot of that beauty reflected within it. But could there have been other purposes, other intentions behind this very impressive structure? And really, I would just like to hear what some of your theories are on how they actually built this. And I know one of the prevailing theories is now geopolymers, but you still have to actually have the logistical capacity to move all these geopolymers and actually pour all this. So how was it really done? Was it done with some sort of advanced infrastructure system, which it had to have been done, advanced roads, advanced travel systems, or was it done with some sort of aerial delivery system, some sort of advanced airships that we've speculated on? We'll see what appears to be the added Buddhist elements of this temple, and it does reflect of the great spirituality that accompanies Buddhism. And indeed, all the major religions of the world reflect great spirituality in their baseline statements, and yet all of them have the same institutions that accompany them. So it's quite a fascinating dichotomy when you're trying to understand and explain what the religious effect of a particular religious structure is, and compare and contrast that with what the institution of the religion is telling you about it. It's also fascinating when you think about the fact that our religions are supposed to be about focus on spirituality and an internal focus, and yet we seem to have such a devotion to an external focus. And really what I'm doing is I'm just examining the mainstream account there, because we're told one thing, but then we're showed something different, and then we do something that's different from what we're told and what we're shown. And that's something we have to question, because I believe there is a lot of validity in our major religions, and I believe that the basic tenets of them are something that reflect the older world. The concept of achieving a real balance between the individual. And for whatever reason, in many of the tenets of Far Eastern philosophy, it seems as though the older world seems to have survived intact. And it's not something that's mingled or muddled by the whole concept of words. And you can certainly look in the book 1984 to see how language can be altered, even speaking the exact same language, because you can change the meanings of words. Let's just take the word sanction, for example. Sanction, a word in the English language that has two entirely opposite meanings. You sanction my videos? What do you really mean? Are you supporting my production of these videos? Or are you saying that I am not allowed to produce the videos? That's just one example. And the reason I highlight that example is because I believe we see this contradiction. This contradiction is present everywhere when you examine this structure in Bangkok, Thailand. You see a structure that is very advanced, and yet you're supposed to believe that in the 19th century, a bunch of individuals managed to carve all this out. At least that's what I think the mainstream would have us believe. But do they have some other very elaborate explanation for it? They managed to channel water from the river, and then the river slowly grounded out the structure of this impressive temple. Now, I know one of the comments I've gotten is the images that I show are not always of the finest quality. And one of the reasons that I do that is I want to show a little bit of a different impression of the images. There's also something that I question with the constant use of high-definition images. Now, I'm not saying that I suspect that high-definition images are altered, but it's intriguing to me how, when I viewed one of my favorite films in high definition, I noticed that somehow it seems to have been changed in subtle ways, as opposed to looking at the original film in its original definition. Now, it's almost as though we're being conditioned to want to see things in a particular way. Now, my personal preference would be to actually get on the ground and really do an on-site exploration of this impressive temple in Thailand. Yet, we can still get the idea, and I'm simply trying to encourage the idea that we need to do our own explorations. We need to do our own research, and every individual should follow up as they feel fit on trying to explain what the original origin of this impressive temple in Bangkok really was. And that was actually how I facilitated my classes back when I did teach. And of course, I drew a great deal of criticism and derisive comments from some of my colleagues because they thought I should just be doing lectures all the time, and if I bored my students out of their mind, then they would retain it. And it's always interesting how none of them had any interest in talking about history or wanting to think about it after time. But isn't it funny how many people now suddenly seem to be coming out of the woodwork and challenging alternative explanations for what they believe are well-documented historical events? There certainly has to be a reason behind that. What exactly do the figures represent here in the tower? Are the figures some sort of advanced human beings of the past? Do they represent some sort of spiritual originality that we had? Or are they simply reflections of a long past time? One of the things that's crossing my mind when I look at this temple is this really a temple from the 4th era? Or could this actually be a surviving structure from the 3rd era? It is entirely possible that there were some structures that may have survived the reset from the 3rd to the 4th era. And perhaps this reflects one of them, and that's how we can explain what appears to be great age in this main prang or tower. We're told by the mainstream that they had to do renovations in the 2010s on this main tower. Now, why are we always doing renovations? Again, we have some of the same story beats with all of these wonderful edifices, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in Europe, Russia, or down here in Thailand, that these structures are eroding over time because they were poorly constructed. And I find it very hard to believe that this main tower was actually built in the 19th century. But perhaps it was built in a period of time that we're simply told was the 19th century, and it's far older. Could there also be some more radical explanations for what this structure originally was? Was this some sort of incredible power generation structure? Look at these interesting figures here by this building. And of course you have the pointy tower. And what exactly do these figures represent? Okay, look, I'm going to go there. I'm just going to say that these remind me of the guards from the movie Big Trouble in Little China. Even though this doesn't have anything to do with China, there's no doubt that this very unique aesthetic influenced that film. Now, could John Carpenter have been trying to communicate something to us by telling us about that film and those figures? Certainly. This is one of the oldest images that we have of this particular temple, and I find it interesting that this is from the 19th century, and of course they're not going to show you the main praying. Not because I'm suggesting that it was already there, I'm just saying that they coincidentally don't show it in any of the old photos. And don't even ask me about construction photos, because I have a feeling that there are none to be found. I couldn't find any in my initial attempts, but maybe you can find some and let me know and share them. It'd be interesting to see what kind of construction photos they have of a structure such as this. Just hang up the tarps and you'll be shielded from the wind as you are very carefully carving all these intricate detailed figures. Now, the Buddha statues here are interesting because they do appear to have been added later, but were they? Or was there some other explanation? And of course we have advanced columns with decoration towards the top. So you can see that it wasn't just the Romans who did the advanced columns. What else is advanced though in this tower is also seeing how it's layered and detailed. Now, someone will try to tell us that, yes, this matches the great Gothic carvings that they did in Europe when they built all those cathedrals over the last 1,000 years. But does it really? And then there's always the explanation of, well, these are different cultures across different lands. But one of the things we suspect with the Fourth Era is that all these cultures were present. It's just that they managed to live together in harmony and achieve a joint civilization. So it is possible that this structure could have come from the Fourth Era. But for some reason, I'm suspecting that it came from the Third Era, and that all the attempts at renovation to make it look newer are to try to reflect that. Here, even on this image, you can see in this little, we'll just call it a banister, all the detail that's carved on it. And you can see it behind these individuals as well in this photo. Very impressive. Well, let's consider Mount Meru, and one thing I didn't mention about the temple we just looked at and the temple we're going to look at is that the central towers reflect Mount Meru. What's the explanation behind Mount Meru? Well, it's a cosmological explanation that comes from Buddhism, that Mount Meru represents the main mountain that all life on the lands came from. And it's a very interesting consideration because we think about how life may have evolved on the land, and is this a more accurate story of our origin? We're not exactly certain, but it is intriguing to me how Mount Meru may well be reflected on those old maps that we look at, especially when we look at a certain polar region that we're not supposed to discuss. And there are many different depictions for the concept of Mount Meru, and it's intriguing for me to realize that Mount Meru doesn't necessarily reflect a geographically limited area. It reflects the existence of all things, that all life and all structure of the lands revolves around Mount Meru. So is it something that's really limited by a geographical definition, or is it something that manages to be both? And oftentimes these are confusing and conflicting thoughts, but given the fact that we deal with nothing but conflict from even our mainstream account, it's how we have to approach things. A lot of the artwork and a lot of the genesis of Mount Meru is very beautiful, and it's one of the baseline tenets of the origin of the lands, and I think there's a lot to be said for it. There's also the fact that many of the structures are supposedly built to reflect Mount Meru. Now, could it be possible that this is a remnant of an older philosophy? There's no doubt about it. And here, is this a representation of Discworld, for those of you that are familiar with that fictional or science fiction story, where we have the turtle and the elephants that's actually carrying the known land on it? Well, it seems to be something that's reflected in the artwork quite frequently. And perhaps within this, we can find more accurate descriptions for what the true genesis and development of the land was over the time. Well, let's go and look at our other structure, or temple complex, because we're not looking at tombs today. And we head over to Cambodia to look at Angkor Wat. And we can see very developed temple complexes here with fine geometrical patterns. Now, the mainstream tells us that Angkor Wat is the largest religious structure in the lands. But I question that, and I don't question that because I question the true beauty and utter amazing aspects of this structure, which we can see here on the ground. But the reason I question that is I don't wonder if the mainstream is trying to mislead us. because there are many things that are conflicting. Now, are they trying to intentionally mislead us, or are they just incidentally misleading us? Well, that's a question we can debate at some other time. But once again, we see a very advanced temple complex. Very unique figures here. Are these reflecting lions, jackals, or something else? Or some other creature that may have existed from a time long past? And don't worry, the mainstream has an explanation for us, and even though they say that evolution could have included every sort of creature ever imagined to have existed, they can assure us that these creatures did not exist. So don't bother trying to question it through that means. Look at some of the very advanced construction details, though, in this temple complex. And we're told that these are the architectural efforts of the 12th century from the Khmer Empire. So, once again, we have kings and we have empires in Southeast Asia, and don't expect to find anything else, especially from the past. We see very impressive pillars and columns, and yet they have a different artistic appeal to them, and yet we can see the figures. So overall, we have Angkor Wat. We're told it's in the Angkor Wat style. It's a Hindu-Buddhist temple complex, and construction took place over 28 years in the 12th century. And we know the king, and we know the religious figure who inspired the king to do it. Once again, reflecting the same pattern of stories that we have from Europe and from across the lands. So it's as though our imagination, our historical account is not that good. Or if it is accurate, it seems that human beings are a lot more alike than we like to admit. But if we're so much alike, then why are we always so fixated on killing each other, or trying to say that one group is superior to another, or one group is inferior to another, which we still do. We're tricked into doing it quite effectively every day. This temple complex is stunning to look at. And it really boils the question down, was there something from the era that this was originally constructed in where we have a true integration with nature? Because you can even see there's something much more organic with this entire temple complex. And the explanation will be, well, it's closing on 1,000 years old. So given the fact that it's down there in Southeast Asia and the environment's different, it's a jungle and there's a lot more rain, it only makes sense. But actually what I find impressive is that with the effects of that unrelenting humidity that area is known for, all of these structures have endured so well. And look at all these figures. And what exactly does this originally represent? There seems to be some sort of aspect of humanity that we're seeing here that goes beyond the simple explanation that we have for our religious tenets. I'm not discounting them, but I can understand why someone would come across a structure like this and simply want to label it a temple or a tomb. Because how else do you really explain it? And even with all of our supposed advanced methods of construction and technology that we have now, could anybody do this? Could anybody build a temple complex like this now? And if they could, how long would it take? Those are the kind of questions we have to ask. And what is the true nature of the construction material within this temple complex? Is this a geopolymer? Is this some sort of advanced construction material that we can't even begin to imagine? Something that they were able to form in place in sectionals and then place in the actual structure and fix together in means that we can't even begin to understand. Some of these images are just truly astounding with the fact that we see an integration of nature with this artificial structure. And I find that looking at the images of this structure indicate that this is something that's far older than we've been led to believe. And yet you still see the precision and the detail in all these figures. An army of individuals that just decided to go up there and carve this during very difficult times in the 12th century. And yet these figures are of the very finest that we've seen across all the lands. The intricate detail. So while there is the explanation that this has something to do with power generation, I believe that the original origin of the structure had many more purposes than simple power generation. And we also have to remember that if this is a surviving structure from the Third Era, then what we're looking at is something that's small in terms of scale, because we believe that there were much larger structures that were destroyed by much greater forces at that time. And that which survived was that which was remote in that civilization that existed, or was not subjected to the main forces of whatever the particular reset that the Third Era faced. And perhaps that explains a lot of the scorching and degradation that you do see in this very stunning structure. Yet at the same time, so many details have endured. So much of the beauty continues to survive to this day. And this is perhaps the most alluring aspect of Southeast Asia. And it seems as though there was a very concerted attempt during the mid-20th century to, how shall we say, reduce the structures that were in Southeast Asia. Indeed, there's accounts of a conflict between the Khmer Rouge and other forces in Cambodia that led to some damage to this temple complex. Well, fortunately, they were just using small arms, and it was not subjected to more of the destructive implements that we know are at the disposal of our current civilization. It is impressive to see that a structure like this has endured for such a time, and it's very inspirational at the same time, because this is not something that I suspect that was built in the 12th century. I suspect that this is much older. But, conversely, could the timeline still be similar or the same? Yes, it could be, because we just don't know. It goes back to that whole concept of the date paradox. What's the baseline event, and how much time has actually passed? Here's what you really have to think about. You can't verify what happened firsthand prior to your own existence. It's one of the difficulties that we encounter with these explorations. So what you're left to rely on is the mainstream account that you have, or alternative accounts, which may or may not be accurate, or maybe 50% accurate, 50% altered. Unless we're simply supposed to believe, as the mainstream account would have us believe, that every single historical account was maintained in total objectivity by governments, civilizations, and cultures, yes, cultures, that at the same time they will tell us were inherently corrupt. We're told to respect and appreciate the Roman civilization, and yet at the same time we're relentlessly told about how corrupt they were, how evil they were, and how they practiced the horrifying aspects of a society that had its own decay sewn into its very origin. But I suspect that what we had in the past was something far beyond that we did really achieve a balance between the individual and society. And I think that in surviving structures like Angkor Wat in Southeast Asia, in Cambodia and Thailand, we see examples of that. We see examples of the very pinnacle of what humanity can be when we express ourselves and when we manage to explore ourselves on the inside and the outside. We'll be looking more at Southeast Asia. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Welcome to the Rescue to Orbis channel, and today we're going to be looking at Japan's castles, or castles of the land of the rising sun. The castles in Japan seem to be something that might go against the theories that we have of a pre-existing civilization, especially within the land of Japan. These castles are very intricate and ornate, and they're made primarily with wood and stone, and they have a very unique design to them. And yet, when we examine these castles, we'll find that there are particular similarities that we've seen in other castles across the lands. What's intriguing, though, is that as we look closely at these castles, we notice that there is a lot of fine stonework involved in the foundations and the steps, and of course many of the walls. And we'll be informed that, much like castles across the land, that these castles are for military purposes. These are fixed fortifications that are designed to be defended at all costs from infantry and cavalry assaults, and we're well familiar with the shogunate era of Japan and its great conflict that occurred until the Tokugawa shogunate was established after defeating the other contenders for the shogunate. And for those of you who don't know, the shogunate, or shogun, of Japan is the supreme military dictator who rules in name of the emperor. And the Tokugawa shogunate ruled from roughly the 1600s all the way through until the mid-1800s, or the 19th century. Yes, that century again. Here, as we look at Osaka Castle, though, we do see some familiar touches that we've seen in other castles, where we have a very complex and well-developed, geometrically precise foundation structure, and then another structure built on top of it. Now, what's interesting is that when we look at the castles, we see that they have that wood structure to them, and yet we have all these older blocks that also go along with these castles. So, what exactly is going on here? What is the real mystery behind these castles? Were these castles really from the era that we're told that they were built in? And many of them were told were built in the 1600s, some even older. Some of the oldest ones built all the way back in the 12th century. Now, there's other stories that say that they've renovated many of these castles, and after World War II, there was an effort to bring about some renovation and understanding of Japanese history, and we can certainly appreciate that. Yet, isn't it funny how it seems to match many of the other stories that we've seen across the land? And it's also no shortage of castles across the land. We expect to see castles in Europe and Germany, the United Kingdom, Ireland, and yet in our explorations we found that there are castles everywhere. Castles in the United States, New York, Minnesota, Iowa, places you wouldn't expect to come across castles. But in Japan we see that there are these elaborate wooden structures. Now, are these structures that were built potentially by the 5th era civilization or our civilization? Or is there more to them, especially when we look at the aerial imagery from above? And we can see that they have a very complex geometrical pattern, also well integrated with the terrain, and nature integrated with the artificial construction. Always the sign of a more advanced civilization, it would seem. There's also a very serene beauty with many of these lovely Japanese castles. We can see that they seem to fit well within their natural terrain quite perfectly. And yet it's the walls that seem to integrate the most, and then when you have the built-up castles that we're told are made of wood, although, to be honest with you, I haven't actually explored a Japanese castle on site. It's certainly something I would enjoy doing, and throughout my life I have studied Japan, and one of my favorite novels, I will admit, is Shogun, written by James Clavell. James Clavell, who had experiences with the Japanese during the World War II time frame, and they might not have been the most positive experiences, and yet he developed an understanding and a respect for the Japanese culture. We look and we see many of the ornate details that reflect the Japanese culture, especially within these castles. And perhaps that's why we would say that this is something from the mainstream account that seems to go against our theories of a pre-existing civilization, because it seems very clear that these castles represent Japanese culture, and they are confined to the geographical area of Japan, so it all makes sense in a lot of different ways. And yet at the same time, as we look closer, we see many of these more exact rock formations that have a geometric precision to them. And we know what these are signs of when we look at these, the signs of a more advanced civilization that's actually in the foundation eras. Now, what was really going on in Japan? Well, we have the story that there were these great wars between the daimyos, the Japanese feudal lords. They had an emperor, and yet the emperor didn't actually rule Japan from the 1600s to the mid-19th century. Japan was effectively ruled by a shogun, or military dictator, and the rule was called the shogunate. And Tokugawa Ieyasu was the individual who had finally won the wars and unified the nation. Now, interestingly enough, during that entire time frame, we have this account that there was a great time of peace. There was no conflict, and the nation was very stable, interestingly enough, despite having feudalism. Look at this. Look at this kind of precision here in the rocks with these dragon figures. Very interesting and very unique. And what exactly does that tell us? What does that really show us when we think about what we have with many of these fine Japanese castles? We do see triangular shapes that we would think match pediments. There's also an incredible curvature and yet still geometric precision within these castles, just in a different way than what we've seen in other castles in Europe. We also have the same foundation structure with the stones and the walls, and they seem to have a lot of effort that was put into them that reflects exactly all the detailing when it comes to architectural achievement, and then of course the logistics in doing this. And these castles are all over the place in Japan. You'll find them in every single civil authority area or prefecture. When you look at this kind of castle, though, you see a little bit more of an advanced styling with it, and it seems to be more integrated within its walls. And so it seems as though some of the castles are much older, and some of the castles are newer, and indeed the mainstream account does reflect that. Yet, looking at many of the castles, you can see that some, we're told, have been recently renovated or rebuilt in the 20th century, and isn't that always the story? But yet what's original? Well, of course, it's always the foundation structure, the stones that we're admiring right now that make up a very precise wall. Now, does that mean that these castles were originally intended to be on top of these stone structures, or did we have something else that originally reflected this? Did we have something that made a little bit more sense in terms of how the stonework was? Perhaps it was something even more advanced. Here, as we look at Osaka Castle, we can see a very complex series of walls, and Osaka Castle is one of the most famous, and indeed it's where the conflict for who was going to become shogun was finally decided, when the heir was defeated by Tokugawa Ieyasu and his family and clan. And here again, looking at this aerial imagery, we can see a bit of a geometric precision and also integration with the water into the terrain. Now, again, we know where we've seen this before with many of the great cities or the geometrically precise foundation structures, or star forts as they're called. Here, even in this imagery that's supposedly from the 19th century, we can see that Osaka Castle has always had these well-developed blocks and yet integrated castle formations on top of it. Now again, was this something that was built after or before the last reset? It seems to be a little bit confusing. In other words, were the castles added or were they not? We seem to have both indications though. And yet when we know that renovations have occurred, then it is a fact, or at least we can claim it as a fact, that many of the castles were added much later. But yet we have something else. We have a star fort, Gorukaku. And yet, this is a classic European star fort. We're told that Gorukaku was built by a Japanese engineer who was directed by the Tokugawa shogunate to study European methods. And so, of course, he went around to Europe and saw many of these great cities, and they say it, cities, and these star forts, as they call them, and decided that they were going to build their own in Japan. Now, it's intriguing because I remember studying the original base history of Japan, and as I originally understood it, the Tokugawa shogunate was not keen on opening up the isolation policy of Japan. Japan was isolated from the rest of the world, this is according to the official history, and it was only when Commodore Matthew Perry showed up with his gunboat diplomacy that opened Japanese ports to the rest of the world. And the Tokugawa shogunate, now in this history that I'm familiar with that I did not know in the 20th century, even though I studied many different lesson plans on Japan, apparently the Tokugawa shogunate did invite new technological advancements, and so they sent engineers who were able to quickly learn this process of building star forts, and they decided to build this incredible star fort. Now, when they had what was called the Meiji Restoration, that was when the Emperor of Japan reasserted his authority over the entire nation, and the Tokugawa shogunate was forced to resign. There was a war that was fought. And then there was another war that was fought, and apparently the defensive Tokugawa forces used this star fort as their final base. It was not enough to save them from defeat, though. And isn't it funny how that seems to match the many accounts that we have from the United States Civil War of the star forts not actually being effective? Very intriguing that that account matches so perfectly. This is a very pretty one here, though, and I can see why this would be fun to spend Christmas in Japan. You got to give Japan credit. They know what to do with the star fort. They decide to light it up, turn it into a beautiful park, and yes, we have some as historical monuments in the United States, the one that we talked about in St. Augustine, but there's something almost more beautiful and more alluring and intriguing when we look at this one. And of course, like many other star forts, we see it shares the same patterns. Not just the same geometric precision, but also the integration of the natural into the artificial. Now, here's another example. We go to Fort Wagner from the United States Civil War. Certainly somebody had to be aware of this, the charge of the 54th Massachusetts. Now, that's not an avenue of approach. That's not even a mobility corridor. That's a massive choke point where they tried to attack through a prepared engagement area, and it did not go well for the 54th Massachusetts. But of course, their bravery and valor did encourage other African-American soldiers to join the Union Army, and they managed to overcome the South with manpower. You'd think they would have been aware of that, but the other interesting thing is that the Meiji Imperial Restoration Forces had very advanced ships at their disposal. Now keep in mind, this is only about 15-16 years after Perry had even opened up Japan from isolation. And voila, they have steamers, and they have advanced ironclads even. And we did look at ironclads in our exploration of the United States Civil War. So very intriguing that, of course, it's the United States that has an expeditionary contact with Japan, and the official history tells us that the isolation policy ended. Now, when I talk about the original history, I'm talking about how it was the Meiji Restoration, after the emperor was restored to authority, that Japan decided to embark on learning all the wonderful ways of Europe and the United States, so they could become modernized in the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution in Japan because they'd been closed off. Now we look at the sorin that top the Japanese pagodas or Buddhist shrines, and we have many different name components to the sorin, and what do these really look like to you? And you'll see in these upcoming images that there are numerous examples of these sorin on the top of Buddhist shrines, and some that are just displayed out in the open terrain. What exactly do these represent? Now, of course, we're told that this is merely a spiritual representation of Buddhism, and it's integrated into these structures, much in the same way that you see crosses integrated and built into churches. But could it be that these sorin have an entirely different purpose behind them? Are we potentially seeing the remnants of some kind of technology from a pre-existing civilization, or indeed the civilization that preceded our own? And for whatever reason, whatever transpired in Japan, while we're told it's called the Meiji Restoration, what if that was a conflict that was designed to remove an enclave of survivors from before the reset? And then we have this technology that's remaining. And indeed, when you look at this sorin, you have the feeling that this is more advanced technology. Is this some sort of energy generation device? Is this some sort of energy collection device? Or could they even have a much more advanced function? Something beyond our ability to fully imagine. When we talk about how we think on the sounds and the cymatics of all the churches across the land, generating individual and spiritual health within individuals, what if these sorin filled the same function as many of those bells? Perhaps in a different format, not relying necessarily on sound. It's always intriguing when we think about these different aspects of how technology may have worked in the pre-existing civilization. And yet we have a very clear indication across Japan with the establishment of all these sorin here on top of a pagoda. And even the pagoda itself seems like it's an advanced form of technology itself. Now, what are they constructed of? Well, everything. Stone, wood, so we're told. And could they have been constructed of those same materials in pre-existing civilization? Certainly. Looking closer, though, you can see that it has a more technological appearance to it that seems to imply an advancement beyond what we'd initially think, especially for Japan at this time. And then we look at one of the stone-formed ones, very intricate and very detailed. Now, can you really imagine someone going around there and actually carving that out? Or is that some sort of prefabricated structure that served a technological purpose? And we can see how well they're integrated in the terrain. Now, many naysayers will tell us that, yes, this is just a natural appearance for Japan. They have a very beautiful and orderly civilization and always have, and if you want to see a classic example of that, then look no further than watching the miniseries Shogun and see how the European sailors from the Erasmus, the Dutch sailors, compared to the Japanese at the time. There was really no comparison. Of course, then it begs the question, then if that was still their perception of Westerners, why in the heck would they want to adopt Western policies and civilization? But, they have a good story for it. And like I said, I do not recall learning that the Tokugawa shogunate wanted to adopt Western ways. Well, now we're told that because they wanted to adopt Western ways, that's what led to the Meiji Restoration. And then once the emperor was reinstalled as the supreme authority of Japan, he decided to follow the same policy that the Tokugawa shogunate was overthrown for following. So once again, it is the conflicting account. But when you look at these images, you can see that there seems to be a greater technological component that's implied within them. And even this antenna, power harvester, power generator, what could it be? It seems to show something that's of a more advanced technology, an entirely different age than we can fully imagine. And given the ubiquitous presence of all these sorin, or whatever name we want to assign to them, and who knows what their original name was, or what the original language that was spoken, we get the concept, though, that this is something far beyond merely a representation of a religious structure. Of course, it makes sense for it to be labeled and function as a religious structure today, much in the same way that the churches, cathedrals, basilicas that we've explored across the land and other lands. And yet at the same time, while we might think that these castles and these particular structures reflect a different culture, maybe the reality is they reflect a closer baseline to the previous civilization, that we really do have some remnants here that are available in Japan. Let's not forget that it was completely fortuitous that Japan also ended up on the side of destruction in World War II. And we know that Japan was subjected to the same forces that Germany was. And of course, we'll be told that was necessary. It was a global conflict at the time. But I find it more than just a coincidence that we have the same pattern of destruction, and yet we can see in these remaining structures, much as we see in the castles of Germany, there seems to be a much deeper story that goes beyond what we're told, that this was merely the achievements of the medieval times in Japan, just as it was the achievements of the medieval times in Germany. And indeed, you'll find many analogies between Japan and Germany that historians like to highlight now. They talk about how the Teutonic Knights, the German knights, reflected the Japanese samurai, that the Teutonic Knights were really a version of German samurai as they were going about spreading German culture. Although when you really start to compare and contrast after that, it breaks down rather quickly, but that's just my opinion. Looking at this structure, though, you truly get the idea of something that's far more advanced, that has a much greater purpose than what we would truly understand. When you see the antennas on top, or the sorin, whatever you want to call them, use your eyes. What do you see? What do you think all these structures were really designed for? What do you think was the purpose of all these apparatuses that are placed on the top of them? Is it really what we're told? Or is there a much greater story behind it? Does it have a much more in-depth story than we're fully aware of? Because you look at all these pagodas, and even these pagodas are far more advanced. And by the way, you might recall on one of the very original explorations on the channel, I believe it was exploration number 2, when we looked at the Germany book, we noticed that there was a pagoda in Germany too. So I'm not sure. Now let's look at Japanese Western eclectic architecture. So apparently, as a result of this Meiji restoration and this influx of Western influences, Japan decided to adopt Western architecture, of course. Now, this happened in the 19th century. I know you're shocked as everything else happened in the 19th century. There's also these rather bizarre examples of what they call Greco-Asian sculptures. It's a really interesting amalgamation, though, of two cultures in this particular sculpture, and I'm not sure if it's truly accurate or if we're just looking at something that's a representation. But these are actual structures that are very much in Japan, and you can see that this particular structure, we wouldn't be surprised if we saw it in Germany, and after our more recent explorations, we could see something like this in Wisconsin or Iowa in the United States, and yet here it is in Japan. And then, of course, we look at one of the great first banks in Japan, and it has a very elaborate structure to it as well. And as you look towards the top of it, for some reason, I'm reminded of the Anamosa prison that we looked at in Iowa. I wonder if it's even made out of Anamosa limestone. And then we have other structures where we see the classic columns that are integrated into the bricks here, and of course just simply utilization of bricks. But don't you find it intriguing that, once again, it is the 19th century? It's always the 19th century. In fact, they built the Star Fort in Japan in the 19th century. But are all the castles representation of Star Forts? And look at this here. We have a little lion. And why is it we see lions everywhere? Well, now we see lions in Japan too. I guess everybody admired and respected the lion, and that was just another one of those coincidences that just happened to be all across the land. So when you really look deeper, you suddenly understand that the initial impression that we're given of Japan is that it was an isolated nation, an isolated culture, and as a result of which, it's a clear form of evidence that shows us that the mainstream account is correct. And yet when we look closer, we find many aspects, such as this building we're looking at right now, with these particular towers and the layout of this architecture, that seems to completely counter what we're given in the mainstream account. Now, could the mainstream account be correct? Absolutely. But when you look at this evidence firsthand and when you explore these buildings, the likelihood of the mainstream account being correct seems to be diminished every single day with every single exploration. Once again, looking at one of these combination sculptures. What culture is this really representing? Or is this actually representing a society, a civilization from before our time that's not recorded? What makes more sense to you? And yet we have these other buildings that they seem to have modified or renovated that had a different structure, and yet they tried to reincorporate what many people would view as a Japanese structure. In the 20th century, of course, when somebody seemed to realize that they needed to make sure that there was nothing that really busted the narrative, or the mainstream account, as it were. And yet, looking at this particular structure, we've seen this exact structure with this kind of tower on it before. So what does this all really represent? What does this all really tell us? It is a slew of evidence that shows us that first impressions are not correct. That as soon as we do actual explorations, we can find houses, we can find museums, we can find banks, we can find palaces. Yes, we got a palace we're going to look at. That suddenly show us what we would consider the classical Greco-Roman style of architecture. Or, as they call it, the Japanese Western eclectic architecture, just invent a new name, such as the National Museum here. Ah, yes, we have our classic dome here, and I think I see some more lions. What are we going to see next? Griffins? I wouldn't be surprised. But you see the same spires, you see the dome structure, and you see the columns. We know what this architecture truly represents, and we certainly have our ideas behind it. And when you look on the interior, this may as well be any museum that we've been in the United States, or this could even be Union Station in Kansas City. What's really the difference? Well, the official explanation is they suddenly wanted to embrace Western architecture. Suddenly, for no real reason, Japan wanted to be like the West, Europe and the United States. And here is the Akasaka Palace, built 1899 to 1909. And this replicates many buildings that we've supposedly seen in Austria, and it even gives me some trappings of thinking back to our St. Petersburg exploration in the Winter Palace there. And we can see that this is a very well-detailed and well-constructed, ornate palace that has pediments and columns and, of course, the same foundation stones. How is it that the Japanese were able to pull this off so easily in 1899 and 1909? And the answer will be, well, it was the end of the 19th century. They didn't have safety standards. They were all fanatical workers. There were no distractions of modern technology, and doing such things was very easy. Even though they had absolutely no official history of building like this, being able to learn and embrace it rather quickly, just as with the Star Fort earlier, it was a matter of simplicity and dedication. And certainly we don't mean to question the hard work ethic of the Japanese or the innate intelligence, but yet at the same time, it just doesn't make sense that they would suddenly want to embrace this, especially when you see how the Japanese view their culture. That is the conflict. That is the conflicting account. And yet, here we have this very impressive palace that would be right at home in Rome or St. Petersburg or Vienna, most explicitly. And heck, we probably wouldn't even be surprised to see it in, Minneapolis, Minnesota, or Des Moines, Iowa now, to say nothing of Los Angeles or any of the other large cities. And even on the grounds, there are other structures that seem to represent the subsidiary structures that we see when we look at these fine palace complexes. So it's not just a palace, it's actually a palace complex, because why not? And it did take them 10 years to build this ornate palace, but could anybody build a palace like this in 10 years, especially when you look at the entire palace in this image? Seeing the vast structure and the amount of area that it really encompasses. Sure. I'm certain that somebody could do this in 10 years. We just need to have more trained architects and less internet distractions, and then we'll be capable of this. And then looking in the interior, we see the very same ornate detailing that we've seen in the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, in the Iowa State Capitol. Here it's reflected in Japan, because why not? Beautiful chandeliers, everything from the ceiling to the walls to the floors, well decorated and very ornate and detailed. And again, why not have gold trimming? And who knows, maybe it's real gold, because they'll tell us the same story that much like with the Iowa State Capitol, it's cheaper to use real gold than to simply paint things gold, because that makes perfect sense. And it's much cheaper to use 27 very ornate and detailed chandeliers and hang those than just to have a simple lighting system. And we're quite familiar with those columns and pillars that are integrated in the walls, because apparently that's very easy to do as well. Just don't question it. It looks pretty, and they were able to do it. And just because it looks like palaces across the land and it's matched other palaces that we've looked at, that is not an indication that there's anything amiss here. Just take the mainstream account and don't ask questions. But how can we not? When we see this, when we really look in this kind of detail in Japan, it seems as though we have a true link to an older civilization. And here we even have a very detailed library with more of the wondrous chandeliers and the fine decorative detailing within the walls and above every single doorway. Really, I'm kind of reminded of the Iowa State Capitol here, especially with the library. Oh, yes, and then of course in this fine meeting room where we see the wondrous columns integrated in the walls, and it looks like we have two heads of state in this particular picture. I believe the individual in the lower left was recently admired by Charles Barkley. But anyway, I digress. So let's conclude the exploration. The Meiji Restoration, which was when this gentleman, Emperor Meiji, was restored as the Emperor of Japan. And during the Tokugawa shogunate, which had lasted for over 250 years, we're told that the shoguns actually had supreme authority. And this is the resignation of the last Tokugawa shogun in favor of the emperor. Although we're told that the shogun retained some power, there was a very destructive conflict. But in conjunction with that, they also decided to build this very large arsenal. And you might recall that we looked at this arsenal in Japan when we looked at our worldwide conflict that started 1847-1848. Official history tells us that this gentleman, Commodore Matthew C. Perry, was the one who had opened Japan to the rest of the world. But was that what really happened? Or was Commodore Perry leading potentially an expedition? Perhaps Commodore Perry was part of a different military, a different organization than we have a true understanding of. We know of his exploits in the Mexican War, where the United States finally pulled off a successful invasion in expeditionary format because, according to official military history, the War of 1812 was a disaster when the United States tried to invade Canada. But they got their act together for Mexico. We remember the Reset War of 1847, and it seems to be that the Meiji Restoration reflects that because it all falls within that time period. And if you don't recall, go back to that exploration, and we had conflicts going on all over the land from 1847 to 1870. Internal and external conflicts, social upheavals, revolutions, all over. What does it really reflect? In 1980, I talked about the Shogun series, and I think it does give an idea of what we're supposed to believe and embrace that Japanese culture looked like during the Shogun period, right around 1600. And it's a very intriguing story, and it's a well-written novel by James Clavell. And now they have a new Shogun series that's going to be coming out in 2024, and it looks like we have some actor who's doing a great Richard Chamberlain impression here. Oh, I guess he plays music in his spare time, so it looks like he's going to be the Sam Worthington to Perseus, as he will be to Richard Chamberlain. I don't know what to think of this. You know, it's like we always do these series, we can't seem to come up with anything original. You know, just give me Toshiro Mifune. He's a wonderful actor. You know, don't even need to understand what the guy is saying. I guess I'll just let Lord Ishido communicate what I really think of this series. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.
Now once more I must ride with my knights to defend what was and the dream of what could be.
Welcome to the Restudo Orbis channel, and today we're going to be examining the U.S. Civil War, Technological Revolution, or Salvage Operation. We've examined the U.S. Civil War in numerous explorations in the past, and we returned to it after numerous requests based on the last photo op that we looked at. And here we have this painting that depicts Robert E. Lee as the commander of the Union Army during the Battle of Hampton Roads between the ironclad CSS Virginia and USS Monitor. What exactly is going on here? Now, I recall seeing in a book where they said in a caption that this was actually a fictional account, or an account that if Robert E. Lee had actually taken command of Union armies. And in this image, this does appear to be Robert E. Lee, not General Mansfield, as others would say. So I'm not exactly sure what's going on there. We begin our exploration by looking at the H.L. Hundley and its crew. The H.L. Hundley, a Confederate States submarine. Very intriguing that we had submarines during the United States Civil War. A lot of people credit the invention, or at least the notoriety of the submarine, to Jules Verne's Captain Nemo and the Nautilus, and here we have numerous designs for the H.L. Hundley. It would make sense that the Confederate States would innovate a submarine. I'm certainly not questioning that. And yet we see a very impressive design, something that seems as though it's far ahead of its time. We consider the fact that submarines were quite prominent during the Cold War era, and we no doubt remember many of the Tom Clancy novels, and of course the movie Hunt for Red October. We're also told in the official account that the H.L. Hundley was the first submarine to successfully sink another warship, the USS Housatonic. Very intriguing, though, that we have this account and we have a recovered submarine. Is this something that's real? Well, there's something that we can interface with. At least we have images of it, and you can still go and see this in a museum to this day. Now, what could this possibly tell us about a connection? Was this really innovated by the Confederate States, or was this merely adapted or salvaged technology? We look at the prototype of the Hundley, and it almost seems more advanced beyond what was actually used. And we look at the different design types. Now, we could understand why the Confederate States would need to employ submarines. Here we even have reconstructions of what the crew's faces likely looked at. Somewhat morbid and somewhat intriguing that we always have this scientific ability to reconstruct various things. How accurate is it really? But it makes sense that the Confederate States of America would utilize a submarine because, as we're told in the official account, they had a vast discrepancy in terms of industrial capacity when compared to the North or the Union, and they had to modify their tactics, therefore employing the submarine. Although you look at this and you really have to give credit to the individuals that went in the submarine, because submarines were not a well-known or tested technology. We think of somebody stepping onto the transporter on Star Trek for the first time without testing it. And yet, here you can see we do have photos of this submarine. Now, was this really a submarine, or could this have been some other sort of underwater device? Because I've heard in comments before we've looked at the Hunley that maybe it was some sort of torpedo, and this is a recovered torpedo. We also have various personal effects of the crew that were recovered. Here we have this intriguing golden coin and other devices. We're told that this golden coin of one of the Confederate sailors, Dixon, stopped a mini ball and saved him during, I believe it was the Battle of Shiloh. We also have a very intricate gold pocket watch. We've always talked about that, about the use of pocket watches, and we're told that they were invented, and mass-produced right during the Civil War. And then, of course, they had the railroad chronometers. And then we also have this Union ID tag. Another interesting account. This is probably the predecessor to the current military's ID or dog tags, as they're known colloquially, although I don't think they call them that anymore. And strangely enough, we also have the Union's response, the USS Alligator. Now, I have a question about why the Union would be in such a rush to field a submarine if the conflict happened as we believe it did. It made sense for why the Confederates would want to field a submarine, because they were at a vast numerical disparity against the Union Navy during the Civil War, so they would compensate for that by innovating a submarine, and they did have one that pulled off a successful attack. So why would the Union need a submarine of its own called the Alligator? And we do have numerous plans, although we usually have the typical issues when we look at various plans. There are more plans, though, of the USS Alligator. Now, what was the intention behind this? Was this just because of the fact that the Confederates had a really neat and innovative weapon, so the Union had to have their own neat and innovative weapon that was essentially a knockoff of the same thing? And when we look at the ironclads, we'll see how that happened with the CSS Virginia and the USS Monitor. But yet, looking at these plans and considering the application for this, the only real surface navy that the Confederates had were blockade runners. So the Union Navy had a vast numerical advantage. They blockaded all the southern ports. This is what the mainstream account tells us. And the only way for the Confederates to run the blockade was to employ what's called a blockade runner. And so how exactly would this submarine have chased down a blockade runner and sunk it? It's very intriguing. Now, the career of the USS Alligator was not very long, and unfortunately it sunk shortly after it was innovated and fielded. But you can still go and dive and visit its wreckage today, so much like the Hunley, we know that it's real, or something is real. Although we certainly have to ask what's the true account, because it just seems strange that both of these navies would suddenly field submarines, brand new technology. It's also interesting when you juxtapose that over the overall account of the Civil War, because what we're told is that when the Civil War started in 1861 is that both sides didn't think it was going to last longer than 90 days. Indeed, you can even look at that in President Lincoln's initial proclamations about when they were actually going to call militiamen for service and the states to send their forces and how long they were called. Well, 90 days tends to be the number. And then, of course, well, it's going to be a much longer conflict. It's going to be a strategic conflict, so we need to blockade the South and use the Anaconda Plan, which was innovated by General Winfield Scott, who's quite an interesting individual who served in the War of 1812 and was still the commanding general of the Union armies by 1861, although he was afflicted with gout. So quite a couple fascinating accounts with these submarines. The Confederates employing a submarine that conducted a successful attack, although the submarine sank, and then the Union employing its own submarine. It did not carry out any successful attacks, and it sank as well. And you look at this design of the Alligator, and it's very unique, but is this something else where we're possibly looking at some other weapon system and not necessarily what we traditionally think of as a submarine? Is this just the way that they would try to explain this to us, that yes, this is really a submarine? And here you have it with these intricate plans. And I think these plans right here probably give us the most interesting look at what the USS Alligator may have been or really was. So was this really innovative technology from the U.S. Civil War? Or was this something that was salvaged and pressed back into service? What ultimately makes more sense? Because there's a lot of innovations that suddenly seem to come from the Civil War, and it's safe to say that whatever version of history you believe in, whether you accept the mainstream account or you think there's an alternative account to history, you have to ask the question and realize there's always the pattern of conflict, assimilation, and indoctrination. And conflict always seems to be the catalyst for setting everything off. So when we need to field new technology or introduce new technology, if you follow me, to the overall population, then we use conflict. And I show this image again because it's quite intriguing to me, as it shows divers finding the wreck of the USS Alligator. And yet in the different depictions of it, it's almost as though the USS Alligator is more advanced than we might like to believe. Well, let's go on to the ironclad, the CSS Virginia from the Confederate States Navy. So not only did the Confederate States Navy field a very successful submarine, they also fielded the first ironclad. Ironclad, as they were called, because they were ships that were covered in iron. It seemed to be a very novel idea. And the Confederates had captured Gosport Naval Yard after the Union abandoned it once the Civil War started, and Gosport was just part of Virginia. And they raised the ship, the USS Merrimack, put iron on it, renamed it the CSS Virginia, and threatened the Union blockade in Hampton Roads. And it's a very famous battle. And there's even a very interesting movie called Ironclads that was from TNT from the early 90s that you can watch. But this gives you a cross-section of the CSS Virginia, and we're told that the concept of the Virginia itself was not really that innovative. All they did was they slapped armor on the sides and changed a couple different things with it, and that seemed to be all it really took to provide a ship that was so threatening to the Union that President Lincoln himself got personally involved with developing a counter ship, or their own ironclad, because the CSS Virginia was invulnerable to the vast majority of the Union Navy, which was still at that time wooden ships, or so we're told, although we'll find a conflicting account of that in a second. And that as the CSS Virginia was being built, there was a fear that it was going to steam up the Potomac and then shell Washington. Although the funny thing is, we don't really hear of any ironclads that made successful shellings of cities, but maybe it's because they hadn't put those nasty mortars on them. Well, the official account says that the CSS Virginia, with its iron, threatened the Union blockade in Hampton Roads. It sunk the USS Cumberland, a slope of war, and the USS Congress, a frigate, and then it was going to destroy the other three ships and then allow the Confederates to lift the blockade. We still have some interesting imagery, though, that shows us what happened when the CSS Virginia sunk. At least that's what the caption on this picture said. I'm not really sure what to make of it. What do you think when you look at images like this? What does it really tell you? And here we get another example of other ships that may have been fielded at that time. And it's also interesting when you look behind this ship that you can see the U.S. Capitol in the background. Very intriguing. So what are these pictures actually telling us? The other thing that I found interesting, and I had just learned, was, when I originally learned history, one of the concepts was the ship of the line, or a three-decked ship, or 3 decks of guns on a sailing ship. Here we have the smokestack to the CSS Virginia. I've never seen this image before. But anyway, back to what I was saying about the ships of the line. I never knew that the United States Navy had ships of the line, but apparently after the War of 1812, they did field a few. So that's kind of strange. So the CSS Virginia was a terrifying ship. It was considered a crocodile in the water, and when the Union ships engaged it, they couldn't dent it, or stop it, or scratch it. The Cumberland and the Congress failed to even damage it. And here you can see it in a model, and it's a very rudimentary design, but apparently it was very effective as a weapon of war, and it was certainly a terror weapon of war. One of those weapons that doesn't really have a direct military effect, but also has an extreme psychological effect. So the United States Navy fielded the USS Monitor, a ship that they managed to build in 101 days to counter the CSS Virginia. And the USS Monitor was a revolutionary design that had numerous inventions on it. And here we have different aspects of the plans, and I find this very intriguing that there are many different accounts of what the plans of the USS Monitor actually were. But you can see that it doesn't look like any kind of naval vessel that you'd expect to see, and it has the turret. And it was invented by this man, Swedish inventor John Ericsson, and he had been responsible for other inventions for the U.S. Navy, including the USS Princeton, and through some political machinations, so the mainstream account tells us, a gun that was designed by a competing designer exploded and killed a member of the president's cabinet. I believe the Secretary of War, no less. So Ericsson was out of favor with the U.S. Navy because he was blamed for it, even though he didn't construct it. But as the story goes, he was given another chance, and because they were in a bind, Ericsson was the only one who could build them a ship that could counter the CSS Virginia, the Union's own ironclad, the Monitor, in 100 days, which he managed to pull off. Here you're looking at the USS Destroyer, another very interesting design from John Ericsson. And it gives us a different picture that the technology is far more advanced than what we might like to believe. This whole concept of a rotating and revolving turret is very interesting in and of itself, because this is the primary concept to this day on modern naval ships, although naval conflict has changed quite a bit. It's more about carrier and aviation tactics, but during this time, this would be the evolution of weapon systems. And we also think about how a turret's applied in main battle tanks to this day, and this seemed to be the original concept of it, applied on a naval vessel with 2 cannons in the turret and a full crew. They also had a speaking tube and numerous filtration systems that were revolutionary for the time. Now, was the Monitor revolutionary in an invention? Or again, was this simply salvage technology that was cleaned up and pressed back into service the best that they could with what knowledge they had at the time? And one of the theories that we have on the channel is that while there may be some individuals or groups who have some idea of what happened after the reset, do they really have all the information, or are they kept in just as much in the dark? Or even worse, are they given erroneous information that's not true, and then because of the fact that they think that they're part of a privileged group, they're more than willing to protect the secrets of that which is not true, and then people question it. Here is a diagram that shows you the blockade that was going on in Hampton Roads when it was attacked by the CSS Virginia. Now, the CSS Virginia sunk 2 of the Union ships that we talked about, then it battled the Monitor to a draw, and the blockade was preserved. Interesting sketch here of Union Commander Captain, or I think he was Lieutenant John Warden at the time. And yet there's many different images of this individual, but we don't actually have a picture. So quite fascinating that Commander from the Union side didn't even have a picture. We also have the account of the Battle of Drury's Bluff, where the Monitor and several other Union ships attempted to shell a Confederate gun emplacement, and they weren't very effective at that. So what really does this tell you is going on? Are they struggling to figure out how to apply this technology that they recently salvaged and recovered? And let's not forget that just like the submarines, the Monitor sank in heavy waters during a storm. So you almost get the impression that they really didn't exactly know how to apply or use the technology. The Monitor was recovered, apparently, and you can see some images for what the turret looked like. So again, I'm asking the question, was this all technology that we just managed to innovate? That these great inventors who just came out of the woodwork and in 100 days they invented and built a ship that was capable of stopping the CSS Virginia, but then it was not capable of surviving stormy waters, something that, naval ships are known to encounter quite frequently. Here's an image of the Monitor, and we can supposedly see some of the impacts of the cannonballs or the shells fired from the CSS Virginia. And again, I really wonder if that's the actual account, especially when we look at some of the indentations on that. Or could there be another explanation? Well, because of the Monitor, despite the fact that it sunk, but it did stop the CSS Virginia, the United States Navy suddenly constructed many types of these ships. They even had other ironclads that they constructed for the rivers. That we'll get on to that shortly when we consider that account. What is going on with this picture, though? Look at the eyes of some of these crew members on, I believe this is a picture of the Monitor, or at least it's one of the Monitor-type ships. Very bizarre. And then here, once again, we have 2, looks to be officers, scanning and showing the actual impact, but then the impacts of where we see cannon shells or cannonballs are inconsistent with the different images. So, once again, I'm not really sure what's going on. Are we looking at different ships? We're told that really only the Monitor battled the Virginia so fiercely, and it was the only ship that had visible damage on its turret. But did other ships have damage on the turret? And once again, we have that same issue. Is the damage consistent? Did they repair it? Did they replace the iron plates? Also very intriguing that nobody else in the world thought to put iron plating on their ships. You would have thought that the British might have thought to have done it on their ships of the line during the Napoleonic Wars. And I know what you'll be telling me, well look, they had Nelson. They didn't need to put iron on their ships. Funny how Nelson wasn't even mentioned during the Napoleon movie. But I digress. So we have these other images that show us the Monitor type ships, and then even some of the other ironclads. So the other ironclads where they put iron on the ships, and they were considered invulnerable at the time. It was revolutionary. Nobody had ever thought of it before. We had people thinking of steam power and an industrial revolution, but it wasn't until the U.S. Civil War that they really decided to start applying and putting iron on ships. There are accounts that Imperial Russia did it earlier in the 1850s, and I believe there was an account of a British ship that attempted it in the 1850s as well. But then we look at some of the other images that we have of the riverborne ironclads. So While the Union seemed scared that the CSS Virginia was going to steam up the Potomac and shell Washington, it seems like overnight suddenly they started producing a bunch of different ironclads, including these river ironclads, or the city-class ironclads, which the main designer was Mr. Eads, and you might remember him during our explorations of St. Louis. He was the one who was also responsible for building that mighty bridge that we saw, that many people tell me is simply the effects of rustication. Apparently, there are also a lot of people that were alive in St. Louis in the 19th century who are still alive today and saw this firsthand. Yeah, I don't know what to make of that either. But looking at some of these ships, we see that this is a very revolutionary design. Many of these ships do not seem to compare to the classic sailing ships. And so it's clear in the imagery that this is a true step forward in the revolution of naval combat. But was it really a revolution, or was it simply salvaging the technology and putting it back into service for whatever real conflict was going on in the 19th century? Or rather, what conflict was going on that we're told is represented from the United States Civil War? And here we're looking at some of these city-class Union ironclads, which I seem to be able to construct many of them without much challenge. So it conflicts with the account that the CSS Virginia was unstoppable and that the Union couldn't quickly build ironclads. It seems as though they could, and here we even see another example of one of these double-turreted monitor class vessels, which they also had. So it seems that once the United States Navy focused on it, they had no issue building all these ships, even though it was a brand new class. And here's another image of it where you can see the twin turrets. Now, is that, again, really what happened? Or did they really start to find and salvage some of this technology and put it back into service? Again, we have the strange landscape in many of these images. And here we have another image from another ironclad, and I don't think we're seeing any strange things with the eyes and the crew. I like the gentleman back there on top of the turret with the canopy over it, and it's a good way to stay out of the sun. And then here you see a steam paddle wheeler, and it's covered in iron as well. So when you think about this and you really look at a lot of these images and you see some of the questionable things about them, you have to step back and try to look at the images as objectively as possible. We're told that these are representations of what happened during the United States Civil War. But what if these are images of something else entirely happening? Think of some other sort of military force or organized force that's been directed to do something, and that we're merely seeing their actions. Or maybe we're even seeing some other organized force that's simply trying to retrieve, salvage, and then press old technology back into service. Because really, when you think about it, what makes more sense? When you look at a lot of these images, and also the fact that you see a lot of questionable things when you look at the terrain, and that's always the thing that stands out to me in the Civil War photos. It always looks like the terrain is just desiccated and arid. And then we see these strange images of ships that just seem to be almost out of time in a lot of ways. And the official explanation is, no, we're seeing the Civil War, and that happened to be that one time there was a drought going on in Georgia, or other fertile lands just weren't doing well, and they had all these problems, and so that's why they did all this. I'm not sure. And a lot of times I don't know what to make of the images myself, but it's interesting to look at them and try to ponder explanations for what we're really looking at. Here's Mr. Eads again, and here's an image of him during his older days, certainly after he had designed and personally built the bridge in St. Louis, or so we're told. Well, I even have individuals who tell me that it must have been a fire that burned down St. Louis, and that was in the 1850s. But again, looking back at these ships, just think about this if this is really representing something else. What if you're really looking at some sort of expeditionary force that's reaching the lands and is targeting certain populations for other reasons? And we can see it all across the lands. It's not just the United States during the Civil War, where we have vast ships being built in large shipyards with rather suspicious individuals looking around. Now, is this just as we believe? I mean, did you see the smokestacks there? There's also some questionable things going on with a lot of the shipyards when we look at the older images. And I don't think it's quite so easy to always simply explain it away as just saying, yes, this is the United States Civil War, and yes, this is nothing to see here. But when you look at something like this, there's almost something that seems to go beyond our normal expectations for where we were at the level of technology. Now, is this because we were told to expect certain things about where we were at the level of technology in the 1850s, 1860s? Are the images not dated properly? Or are we looking at something completely different? And if we are looking at something completely different, then what kind of questions do we need to really be asking about it? Well, we need to ask what we're actually looking at. We need to try to get an idea of what date it is. We need to make an estimate, because it could be that the images aren't dated properly. We're always told that there were vast technical limitations with photographs, and yet we see so many photographs that seem to defy these technical limitations. Look at that there with the construction of that building there and what appears to be a dock on the bottom left of the picture. We've seen that pattern before many times. And then, of course, you look at some of these other docks and you see things that seem to be a little bit more advanced. Now, we'll be told that this is an image from the later 19th, early 20th century. But again, those decades all seem to run together in some images. It's very difficult to ascertain exactly what time frame you're looking at, such as this facility right here. Are we looking at something from the 1890s, or are we looking at something from before the 1890s? Did the 1890s really happen when the 1890s were said to have happened? That's where things start to get very confusing. And again, when you look at the many smokestacks here in this image, and the ironworks, and I believe this is London, River Thames, and we can see many of these examples of these tremendous facilities. And we'll be told not to question it because these were innovative designs and it was because of the Industrial Revolution, and just don't ask too many questions and it all makes sense. And don't worry about the fact that we also managed to erect tremendous buildings well before the Industrial Revolution. There's always a legitimate explanation for it. One other interesting peculiarity with looking at the images of these city-class riverine ironclads is we're often given the impression that these were boats or ships that were not really built to last. And yet we do have displays that show how they're still around. Of course, the hulls look very, very rotten because they're made of wood, but the iron is still standing. So what's the true account of this? It's really hard to say. So let's move on and take a look at the Intrepid observation balloon. Now, we've looked at this many times with Professor Thaddeus Lowe and his observation balloon corps. Indeed, it was one of the earliest explorations on the channel, exploration number 3. But there are some problematic concepts when we consider why the aerial balloon was used, because does it again point to a much more advanced technology that was once again recovered, salvaged, and pressed back into service for whatever real conflict was going on during the time we think of the 19th century? For example, we have a very clear and precise image of the hydrogen devices that provided the hydrogen for the balloons that Thaddeus Lowe used when he was conducting his observation missions for the Union. Even the images of Thaddeus Lowe seem to give a conflicted account, because are we really looking at the actual individual or merely a representation of them? Because we oftentimes look at these individuals and we see many different looks in some of the images. Here's another image of the good Thaddeus Lowe. And of course, the story was how he had managed to sell his brilliant idea of using observation balloons. And if you really think about it, it would provide a wonderful tactical advantage to the Civil War, as we're told it happened, with its Napoleonic tactics of fighting in open battlefields, at least until the end of the war, according to the mainstream, when the Confederates started using trench warfare tactics. But of course, we'll look that they didn't innovate those tactics. There's photo evidence, actually, of the Crimean War, which occurred well before the U.S. Civil War, where they were using trenches. Apparently, they even reenact using Thaddeus Lowe's observation balloon. So maybe you can go and see that reenactment and ride on the observation balloon and pretend you're Thaddeus Lowe. Now let's go to the Gatling gun. The Gatling gun, or the father of the machine gun, as it was called by some historians, properly or improperly so. The Gatling gun was certainly something that changed everything, although it was not favored by Union commanders. Now, this was a rapid fire. Really, it was the predecessor to the machine gun. Crank operated, and it could put a lot of rounds downrange very quickly, especially when compared to the musket rifles at the time or whatever other rifle systems or weapons they were using. But commanders weren't particularly fond of it in the Civil War, and why? The answer we're given is because of the ammunition consumption and logistical limitations. Yes, you heard that properly. A new revolutionary weapon system was not favored because it used too much ammunition, and there were logistical limitations. It's very rare that we hear about the consideration of logistical limitations in the Civil War. And don't you find that strange when we have all these armies that were living off the land for long periods of time, but the ammunition supply would break down? Now, there are other accounts of Gatling guns being used during the Plains Indian Wars, as it was called, and the fact Custer didn't take the Gatling guns with him, and it might have made a difference in Custer's last stand. No, it probably wouldn't. Custer definitely seemed to have an idea of losing, and some people are supposed to lose, if you know what I mean. But when you look at some of these images, and you think about this other piece of technology that once again was found and put back into service, and things get even more interesting when we consider this Gatling gun originally being crank operated. You just had an operator that would turn the crank and the weapon would fire as the barrels would spin. But this was not just a weapon system and a design that would be lost and neglected at the end of the 19th century, as many would think. And here it looks like we even have British soldiers employing this type of weapon system. So it seemed to be very effective once everybody got over the logistical limitations, and the design was brought back in the 1960s by the United States military and fielded in a variety of means, even a shoulder-carried version, which you might recall famous individuals or people that might be wrongly thought of as famous, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Jesse Ventura, using them in films such as The Predator, Terminator, and so forth. And the minigun, the 7.62 version, called mini because there's a larger version that's often used by attack aviation and aircraft and other fighting vehicles or armored fighting vehicles for the Army. And here's an example of a helicopter door gunner using one during Vietnam. And this was considered a very effective rapid-fire weapon. This could put a lot of rounds down range, and yet this is based on the exact same design from the original Gatling gun. In fact, the minigun was even used on the Batwing in the 1989 film Batman. Yes, he had miniguns mounted on the Batwing. And even had an advanced targeting system that Batman used to target the Joker and conduct a strafing run on a very stationary target. Although either the targeting computer was broken or Batman's just a lousy shot because he missed with 10 seconds of strafing run. And if you look up how many rounds put down range, you can find out how many times he missed until he was shot down. Okay, moving on. The bulletproof vest. Apparently there was a bulletproof vest concept that was used during the United States Civil War. One of the questions that gets brought up whenever you go on a Civil War reenactment or one of those historical presentations, or you encounter an annoying historian, such as I used to be, they ask, why didn't the Union or the Confederate soldiers wear body armor? Well, apparently they did. In fact, this individual, Colonel Albert Brackett from the 9th Illinois Cavalry, was saved by his bulletproof vest. There was an account that he took a hit directly in the chest and he survived. And you can see he's doing the Al Bundy pose, or at least the Al Bundy pose in the 19th century with a hand in the coat. I'm surprised this guy's name wasn't Captain Sam Beckett. You might have noticed they said his rank was Colonel, but yet in that previous picture he was wearing Captain insignia. So I guess at least Captain Sam Beckett here was wearing the proper rank insignia based on his rank. But I digress. There were also accounts of Union armies living off the land for some of these elaborate expeditions. Indeed, some expeditions that didn't go so well deep into Arkansas, and then we have the famous Sherman's March to the Sea through Georgia. And now let's move on to the concept of trench warfare. So one of the big innovations from Civil War towards the end, the United States Civil War, is trench warfare. A lot of people seem to indicate that, yes, they invented trench warfare during the Civil War. Although there are accounts of many other nations using it. When you look at the images from the Crimean War, which we will in a moment, you can see that it's very clear that they were using trench warfare in the Crimean War. So again, why would it be such a revolutionary concept to dig trenches like this? But a better question I have is, how exactly did they manage to dig trenches like this? In modern militaries, when they dig fighting positions for armored fighting vehicles, it takes D7 dozers quite some time to do it. And we're to believe that these very deep and elaborate trenches were all dug by hand. How long were they in these static positions? And why would they need to do this anyway when they had these forts that are very geometrically precisely shaped all over the place that they would fight from? Yet you have many different images. Oh, look at that. This is from the Crimean War, and it looks like the British Army had the nuclear-capable mortars that the Union Army did. You know, the ones they used to level many cities in the South that we've looked at many images of in the past. But I really wonder, consider the amount of dirt that had to be moved in these elaborate trench systems. Was this all done by hand? And was this all done in a reasonable amount of time? Were these all just static positions like World War I was? Because that was the most famous instance of trench warfare. And the reason we're told those trenches got so elaborate was that the lines didn't move. In other words, one side didn't advance that far and the other side didn't advance that far. It was very static. And from a military historian's perspective, World War I was very depressing because for the concept of soldiers being stuck in trenches, you have all kinds of problems. It rains, you have immersion foot, there's rats, there's all kinds of horrifying accounts of it. And there's probably a reason why you don't see Civil War reenactors doing the whole trench warfare thing, or really reenactors doing anything from World War I, at least in terms of reenacting the trench warfare. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, I've just never come across it myself. Let me know in the comments if you've seen someone reenacting trench warfare. It's very interesting. So the whole concept of trench warfare. The real question, how exactly did they move all the dirt in those images? How long did it take? Were they just in those positions for all that time, much like they were in World War I? Are we to believe that those were static positions or installations? Very hard to tell. And now we consider the armored train concept. And we're told that the armored train concept was really innovated in the 19th century. Along with everything else, since it seems like pretty much the entire world was invented in the 19th century. I mean, they basically say that Tesla invented wireless in the 19th century, and that's now what we use on our phones and everything else, although who knows the veracity of that. I'm being a little facetious, but serious at the same time. So the armored trains came by a long, long time with the whole turret concept. You can see some advanced turrets on here. And it originally came from this, just a armored train car that was used, or a land ironclad, as it were. There's even an account, I'm trying to recall which battle it was, I believe it was the 7 Days Battle, when McClellan's army threatened Richmond, although he was unable to actually seize Richmond, as winning battles was just not something McClellan was really keen on. But we don't need to be bad-mouthing Ken Burns' hero anymore. I mean, his tragic figure. But looking at these many different trains and the way this evolved supposedly over time, did this really evolve, or was this a technology that again was already available? Now we're told that by about World War II, modern militaries got away from the armored train concept. Someone asked me what I thought of the recent Napoleon movie from Ridley Scott, and I think this image here of Napoleon and the expression on his face adequately reflects the feelings and my perception of the film. Although I'll be honest, my real disappointment was we didn't get to see a cameo from the very famous Richard Sharp. But maybe in the next movie from Ridley Scott about Napoleon, we'll get to see it. Well, thank you for joining me. Boston, the hub city of the old world. Welcome, and today our explorations take us to one of the oldest municipalities in the United States, Boston. Settled in 1630 by Puritan settlers from Boston, Lincolnshire, in Great Britain, we're told that this is one of the most unique and culturally rich old areas in the United States. Several of our explorations we've been trotting around the United States and then other parts of the world, but I felt it fitting to come back and finish Boston because, being one of the oldest municipalities according to the official account, there are many intriguing aspects to explore. There's also one of the greatest building anomalies I think I've seen so far in these explorations. So let's take a close look at Boston and see what questions we can ask and what answers we can find. Thank you for joining me today. We have many old maps of Boston, and we can see that it played a very significant role in the American Revolutionary conflict against Great Britain. Boston was in fact the center of that conflict. Boston being located in Massachusetts off the Shawmut Peninsula. I've also heard it pronounced the Shamu Peninsula, although I think that was one of my colleagues just playing a joke on me. You might have noticed, if you're a frequent viewer of this channel, that I often poke fun at pronunciations, and the reason for that is many of the esteemed individuals I worked with in academia who claim to have been from many of these areas oftentimes mispronounce the names themselves. So I don't know if I'm calling into question the veracity of their claims or what. But when you look at Boston, you can see that it looked a little different in this old map. And in this old map, they even tell us that it's not fully accurate. So let's take a look at the bird's eye view from the 1870s, and once again we see a very well-developed city. And of course it would make sense for Boston because it's been around since the 1630s. The Puritans were there first from Boston and Lincolnshire. There's also a great story of Robin of Sherwood concerning the Sheriff of Lincolnshire, but I digress. you see that there's many wonderful buildings and infrastructure that was already built out, including that wonderful obelisk that we'll take a look at. Yes, wondrous obelisks and, a very well laid out and complex grid pattern to this city. We also see that there are many maps of it from the 17th and 18th centuries that show that it appears to have been well developed and very well planned out. We also see a series of hills, or what they would call mountains. We referred to how Boston was known for its role in the Revolutionary War, and there are many tales of the Battle of Bunker Hill, although it actually occurred on Baden Hill, and the Patriots, the proficiency of the American militia. When we look at this disposition of British forces, though, in Boston from that conflict time, the 1770s, we look and notice that there's an interesting structure here on Fort Hill. And we've seen these structures before, haven't we? And we've developed a new name for them on this channel. Fort Hill, our geometrically precise foundation structure, GPFS. I know, sometimes you have to have a little fun with the naming conventions on these things. A bastion fort, as they would call it at that time. Yet, looking at Fort Hill today, we see yet another one of these very unique and beautiful standpipe water towers. Now, when I first started these explorations, I did not think that these standpipe water towers were very common. And yet it seems as though every city I go to, especially in the United States, to do an exploration, there is a standpipe water tower. And I want to invite you all in the comments to tell me what you think these structures originally were or what they were for. We've seen them in St. Louis, where they're featured most prominently. We've seen them in Milwaukee in Wisconsin, and even in Madison in Wisconsin. And of course the very pretty one down in Louisville, Kentucky. And here we have one in Boston as well, along with a very unique structure next to it, and different pictures which seem to give a different indication as to how this structure was used and established. What was really the purpose behind these standpipe water towers? Many beautiful brick that went into the construction, and elaborate knowledge of how to arrange brick at a high altitude, especially at that time, when we're told that people couldn't really go very high, or it was more difficult. I'm always impressed, though, by the arrangement of the bricks at the higher altitudes when they build these structures, and these standpipe water towers are a recurring theme with that. Perhaps the area that's most known in Boston, though, is Beacon Hill, which is the oldest portion of the complex downtown area. And in the interest of full disclosure, I am not from Boston. I've only been through there a few times in my life. And this goes way back in the day when I'll admit that I was a Celtics fan. And yes, I do remember how to park at Boston Garden without paying for parking. And I am aware of little details that Boston College is not actually in Boston. But do I know anybody named Sully? No, just Agent Scully from the X-Files. Looking at this old image, though, you can see that there were many hills and mountains in Boston. And once again, we have another one of these tales from the 1840s of this major excavation project. And they even say that when they cut down some of these mountains, and you can see how they did it with pickaxes and horses, they used it to reclaim the land. And this is Beacon Hill as it appears today. Very pretty, complex urban terrain, and yet at the same time, very well laid out. You'll also find a little bit of a settling image with Boston when you look at it. And yet we also have some very old images of Boston from 1850 to 1910. And you may not be surprised to know that once again we also have another story of a fire. We'll get to that in a second. Let's look at some images, though. And I also know there's a difference between Fenway Park and the Fenway. So that's about the extent of my knowledge with Boston. But looking at some of these older images, along with the bird's eye view map, we once again get the impression that this was a very well-developed city a very long time ago. And when we question the narrative, or the official historical account, as we call it on this channel, because that's what it is technically the official historical account, we find once again that we pose many questions just by looking at the images, because oftentimes the images that we look at, such as in this case, cause us to question what we're told in the official account. And here's the old Boston City Hall. And believe it or not, this one's still standing today, and we'll take a closer look at it. Still very impressive for 19th century architecture and achievements, even for a city that had been around. And looking at the foundations of this bridge, again, another 19th century photo, although looking at the photos themselves, you always get more questions and answers in terms of their quality, and there seems to be a lot of variety in the quality. Boston is well known as being settled by many Irish, and strangely enough, you don't really have any accounts of the Know Nothing Party, which was a political party that existed in the United States from 1850 to 1860, and then just seemed to magically go away once the United States Civil War started. But what's known about the Know Nothing Party is they didn't really care for all the immigrants that were coming into the United States at the time. There's also accounts of how Boston played a significant role in the Civil War. It's interesting when you look at how Boston played a role in the Revolutionary War and then it went away. Then they changed it from a town to a city, and there's really not much history until 1850 when they started playing their major role as an abolitionist city, or a city that was against the role of slavery in the United States and wanted to put a stop to it. This is one of the older images of Boston, an aerial image from 1860, obviously taken from some sort of balloon. And once again, we see a very well-developed and complex urban terrain that's impressive for the 1860s. We also see other buildings that have all these little stylings and decorations that go within them. So not just the major municipal and religious buildings, but also many of the residential buildings. And many of these endure to this day. And just so you know, we'll be covering the MIT in a future exploration, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. That's worthy of an exploration in and of itself. It should be noted, though, that Boston seems to be an area of learning and culture and development, and that's always been true, regardless of whether we go with the official account or just looking at what remains of the buildings there. There's always the reputation of how Boston was the foundational portion of the United States Civil War. This is an interesting home here that was supposedly a home for tuberculosis patients. I always find it interesting how they got an elaborate structure where they could recover and convalesce. Well, let's take a look at some images of the Boston Fire from 1872. The Boston Fire, once again, another one of these very crazy disasters that occurred in all these cities in the 19th century. And as part of our questions, we see that the fire seemed to have the ability to reduce many buildings to rubble. And not just large rubble, but also small rubble. I'm trying to figure out exactly what's going on in these images, and I certainly invite your comments. What do you think of this? We have very large brick buildings, stone buildings, and other construction materials, granite even, that we wouldn't think would be susceptible to fire. Although it's intriguing when you try to ascertain what the burning temperature of fire is, and you'll get all kinds of different answers. You'll also get different answers in terms of what materials burn at what temperatures. But once again, we see these very unique diagonal cuts, and we also just see a lot of rubble within these fires. We're told that the Boston Fire was just as destructive as the Chicago Fire. But what's interesting, though, is that the Chicago Fire is stated to have destroyed the entire city of Chicago, and they simply had to rebuild it. Also in the same decade. Another coincidence, I'm sure. But you look at some of these structures and you look at how they're rubbled, and they try to justify this. We did look at the Boston Fire in an earlier exploration on this channel when we were talking about the power of fire. It's interesting how fire can have a wide swath of destruction, or it can be very specific, such as confined to a single building. But when you look at some of the images of this rubble, this is where you have to ask these questions, because it causes you to consider what's really going on. If what you see with your eyes in the image doesn't match the official account, do you simply accept the official account, or do you ask questions and look for answers? A lot of people will simply be satisfied with, well, I went to the museum and I saw these images and I have the official account and these images actually back up the official account. How exactly do you explain the details of this destruction? And they try to do it by saying that the Boston Fire Department was not prepared to handle this fire. They don't really give a good explanation for the cause of the fire, naturally. And then you have conflicting images such as this with the presence of the town militia or whatever military force was around at the time, standing and posing for a picture in front of buildings that were completely destroyed. Again, rubbling like this, you have to go to images of saturation bombing, as they called it, or carpet bombing from World War II to find anything that really compares. And yet, looking at the wider swaths of destruction, the images almost portray the story that Boston was completely leveled by this fire. But we'll see towards the end of this presentation that that's not what the official account tells us is the case. The other thing they'll try to also explain is that several aspects of the building were made of wood and were therefore susceptible to fire. But was wood holding up all this stone and what looks to be very advanced concrete at the time? And the fire caused the foundation structures of the wood to simply burn or melt, and then the buildings lost their structural integrity and all fell apart? Now in this image you do see some of the buildings that weren't damaged by the fire. Once again though, it's always the buildings in the background. So a little bit of a conflicting account here. Was the whole city destroyed by fire or wasn't it? Some of the destruction seems to be a lot more specific too, which is interesting to consider because, like we said earlier, does fire destroy a wide swath or is it confined to a certain area? Once again, this being 1870, you're still impressed by what remains of the buildings. And it's also interesting how these look familiar to photos of other destruction that we've seen in other cities across the United States, whether it's from the 19th century or the early 20th century. Look at this building here. It looks like we have almost cannonballs going through some of these holes here, but what really happened? Was this another example of a Union army that made a wrong turn and decided to come north? I remember watching an old episode of Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman, and if you're not familiar with it, Dr. Quinn was from Boston, and I remember when she visited Boston, and I think it was set right around the 1870s, but no mention of this very destructive fire. This is supposedly a granite structure that was melted by the fire. And what kind of temperature of fire melts granite? Well, like I said, look it up and you'll get different answers. And then, of course, in this bird's eye view that someone did, we see that the destruction really didn't encompass most of the city. Now, I'm not diminishing or saying it's not terrible, but once again, it's a conflicting account. And it is just a painted picture. Well, let's take a look at Bunker Hill Monument, built 1825 to 1843. And this was that great obelisk that we saw in the bird's eye view earlier. Once again, another impressive obelisk that was built in the early to mid-19th century to commemorate the Battle of Bunker Hill, although it's actually sitting on Baden Hill, which is where the battle actually occurred. So why was it called Bunker Hill? Because supposedly that was the original objective of the British Army when they were trying to seize where the militia of Boston and Massachusetts had set up at the time. Quite a monument, and it should be noted it was completed well before the Washington Monument. Colonel William Prescott, the militia officer who was famous for saying, "Don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes." And I'll just relay to you, the first time I heard that was when I was watching a Bugs Bunny cartoon, when he was going up against Sam von Spam, the Hessian. They also have a nice little structure that's built next to this obelisk, and of course it's this old, what we'd call a Roman Greco structure. Nice little pediment and columns, and while it may be smaller, it should be interesting to note that all the details of architecture are still present on it. So it wasn't enough that they built a gigantic obelisk as a memorial to the Battle of Bunker Hill on Baden Hill. They also built this little structure to commemorate it as well. And it's no less impressive because you even have the door decorations and all the little trimmings that we've come to expect on pediments and columns that we see in all these explorations. I'm surprised we didn't get some story about how they moved this obelisk from someplace in Egypt or even Rome, block by block, and reestablished it in the United States, because apparently that was an easy thing to do back then, Here's our construction drawing that we have of the obelisk, very convincing, because photography hadn't been invented, or so we're told, at the time this incredible obelisk was constructed. And when you look at it from different images, you can also get a feeling for some of the older buildings that still exist in this portion of Boston around this obelisk. And you can see that it was made of very intricate blocks. And it's also part of many beautiful vistas as to where you can get an idea of some of the wondrous culture that still survives in Boston. It is a very pretty city to visit, and it's certainly one I would like to go see again. And what obelisk would be complete without a spiral stairway within it? Because it's not impressive enough that they built the obelisk in 1825 to 1843. Why not just put a staircase in it so you could go to the top of it? I mean, what's the point of having a tall obelisk like this unless you can actually go into it and walk to the top? Long before anybody was thinking about that arch in St. Louis that wouldn't be built till the 20th century. I think this is just a little more impressive. And I only say that because of the time frame that it was supposedly done. If, of course, we accept the official historical account without question, which you're more than welcome to do. And do so at your own discretion. Now let's look at the Boston Garden, built in 1928 in 11 months and demolished in 1995. I did not cover this during the stadium exploration because I wanted to cover this with Boston, and I'd been looking to do an exploration of Boston for some time. The Boston Garden is an impressive Art Deco building, and yes, I've been to this building before it was unfortunately demolished in the 1990s to watch many Boston Celtics games. Yes, I'm a Midwest person who was quite a fan of the Boston Celtics. Look, in the 1980s, you went one of two ways. You were either a Celtics fan or you were a Lakers fan, and it was interesting in my family. My father and I were Celtics fans, and my brother was a Lakers fan. So, yeah, interesting times in the 80s. Unfortunately, they demolished this building, and this was quite a tragic loss, and there was a lot of controversy about it, supposedly, in Boston at the time. No, I wasn't there when they tore it down, but I certainly saw the articles, and given the history behind this building and the rich history, even the sports history, if you look at from the Boston Celtics and the hockey team. I don't really follow hockey in interest of full disclosure, but it's very sad to see that a wonderful Art Deco building like this was torn down. And the reason we're given is because it was old, it didn't have air conditioning, and it was very uncomfortable with the seating. The usual reasons that we're given. Let's look at Fenway Park, built in 1912. Now, this also goes back to the stadium explorations, and Fenway Park is the oldest active Major League ballpark, and there's quite a storied history with the Boston Red Sox. And of course, many people will be telling me, yes, and Boston is known for being the home of Matt Damon and Ben Affleck, and that's true. In just about every Ben Affleck movie you watch that's contemporary, you'll see a reference to the Red Sox, even in the science fiction movie Paycheck. Very impressive, though, with Fenway Park here, and you see something that seems as though there's a different story behind it, especially when you look at the front facade and the entryway to this stadium. And it has a rich and storied history, and I am impressed by the fact that it has survived this long, and even in some of the seating here, you get the hint of a different kind of architectural styling done at the very early 20th century. The layout is also interesting, and they'll tell you to this day it's a little bit more difficult to get to Fenway Park, and this just shows you how it sits in the current city of Boston with the complex urban terrain. Again, another one of these signs that we see with these old world cities, as we call them when we look at them. Very beautiful park, and I'm glad that this is something that still survives, because this is something you can visit to this day and get an idea of how something was supposedly constructed in the early 20th century. Now, was it? I'm not sure. However, it is another example of something that you can evaluate for yourself. Now let's go to the Boston Custom House, built in 1849, the most amazing building ever. And why am I saying this is the most amazing building ever? Well, just stay with me for a moment. Yes, it's our classic Roman Greco building that has a dome, a pediment, and columns, but being built in 1849 was very impressive, supposedly authorized by President Jackson himself in the 1830s when he was still president, and then built a little while later. And we have another one of these one-dimensional perceptions, a side cutaway of this incredible edifice. But what exactly makes this edifice so incredible, you're probably asking? Well, being built in 1849 and putting this kind of effort into a custom house is interesting, because what's a custom house really supposed to do? Really just inspect the imports into the harbor, and of course we'll have some taxation purposes associated with it. It's still an impressive smaller building, but the official account with it is it was something that they needed in Boston, and of course they had to put a little dome on top of it. Okay, so we've got a little dome, we've got a little building, we've got a very well-documented history with many images, and you're asking, okay, Aurelian, what's so incredible about this building? We've seen many others like it. Well, it was designed by Ami B. Young, a prescient genius. Was he a divine architect? Now, why was I saying this? Because he laid out and designed this building after winning a competition, of course, in the 1840s, and then they built it in 1849. All right, yes, we've seen other buildings that were built at this time, such as the courthouse in St. Louis. What exactly is so special about this one? Well, they added a tower to it. Peabody and Stearns added the tower, building height was moved up to 496 feet, and it was the tallest building in Boston until 1964. Now consider this. They added a tower, and this wasn't a tower that was light, made out of our modern steel and glass and plastic, as we like to build skyscrapers out of now. Oh no, this was a fully well-constructed tower that increased the height of the original Custom House building by a factor of 4 or 5. And you can do the exact math on it, but when you look at it, you also see the extraordinary achievement that the tower itself is almost as wide as the original base building. So how exactly did Ami B. Young know to architect and design a building that was able to support a weight of a tower that they added to it that was 5 times the height of the original building, or more? And we can see that this is all very solid construction and done in the early 20th century, and here you can see the tower on top of the original structure. I think that's just astounding that the original structure was standing for over 60 years when they added that tower to it. And it really does show that Ami B. Young was some sort of extraordinary genius. Or perhaps he was prescient, I'm not sure which. Now you might be saying, okay, well we saw this example with the Singer Building in New York City, and that's true. But the Singer Building had a much wider base, and the tower didn't basically take up the entire base. Now we have construction photos, and of course we have our usual authentic construction photos, which I'm sure will be enough to satisfy the curiosity of many people. So did they have to redo the roof of the original Custom House? Did they have to remove the dome? There's very little in the official account as to how and why they added this great tower to it. Why not just build a new building? And it seems that like many of these other wondrous buildings from the late 19th, early 20th century, we have a model, which of course doesn't even compare with the real thing in terms of visual appearance. Looking at the clock, though, we also have an account that the clock itself didn't run because apparently it was not built to specification. And interesting that it has Arabic numerals and not Roman numerals on it, as we usually see with these older clocks. This is now a hotel. I believe it was a Hyatt, and shooting from the hip here, if not a Marriott. And look at some of the incredible interiors with this building. And keep in mind, this is in the tower right here, and this is supposedly made of all marble. Now, I haven't visited this building in person. I'm certainly going to have to, and verify this. And also remember that this is built on top of a custom house that had been standing for 60 years until they added all of this in the tower. I think this is one of the most impressive architectural achievements. And if the official account is true, then it's clear we could construct buildings that could stand up to any kind of natural disaster and hold a very large tower that increased the height of the building by a factor of 5 for over 100 years. I find that rather a stunning achievement. And you can see that the custom house, once the tower was added, was one of the most prominent features on the Boston skyline. Indeed, many would say it was the first skyscraper within Boston. Very impressive. Let's take a look at the old City Hall, built 1862 to 1865. So just because there was a little civil war going on doesn't mean that Boston wasn't going to build the most incredible imperial empire, Second Empire structure, City Hall. Ah, yes, here's the current City Hall in Boston, built in 1968. Our finest brutalist architecture. I wonder if someone's going to be leading Alex in A Clockwork Orange out of that building. That's what it reminds me of. But going back to the pretty old City Hall, we see once again the wonders of an architectural design from the 1860s. Now, I'm not going to tell you to think which one's prettier or which one you prefer, and by all means, if you want to tell me you prefer the modern brutalist architecture, let me know. Please tell me why in the comments. I'm interested to hear. But in this old City Hall, we see the usual columns and pillars that are integrated into the wall in a very pretty design, not just with the base, but also going up to the roof. Once again, as though no aesthetic was spared. And of course, these are the kind of things that you need to have in a city hall. And we're quite used to seeing these sort of aspects in these buildings now. But no matter how many times we see them, and the whole point of looking in all these explorations is to see just how commonplace this all truly is. Not just in the United States, but across all the land. Because I think that these achievements, whenever they occurred, are extraordinary to this day. And the interior of the old City Hall is no less impressive. Of course, you have columns on the inside, very large doors, and very open cavern areas. This almost kind of reminds me of some of the courthouses that I looked at from Iowa in the 19th century, when you have some of the columns integrated next to the stairway, such as pictured here. And once again, more columns on top of a banister, and again, no detail spared. You can even see it in the ceiling, and you can see it in the banister as well. The nice thing is the old City Hall is preserved in Boston, and you can see it to this day. Rather like that symbol representing Boston in terms of being a hub city. Now, there's conflicting accounts for why they call it a hub city, originally being one of the major cities that was immigrated to by the Irish, and there's quite the reputation of the Irish being in Boston, as any Matt Damon movie from the 1990s will remind you of. I still find these images very intriguing, though, and how they portray Boston as being that hub city. Let's take a look at Symphony Hall, Boston. This was built in 1900 after 16 months. And again, we see the same thing. We have a pediment and columns because we were favoring that in the early 20th century, especially in a place like Boston. Symphony Hall is very impressive, though, because you'll see some of that architectural styling with some of the arches and decorative detailings that go into it. And keep in mind, while Boston was around since the 17th century, most of these architectural achievements were done in the 19th or the early 20th century. And that seems to be a recurring theme that we have with the official account. Once again, I'm glad to see that a building like this survives to this day, and there's something even more impressive about it once we look at the inside. Why is it we don't put this kind of effort into our arts and entertainment today? Because that's what this building was constructed for. It's just like all these opera houses that we had all over the place. Well, this was Boston's version of it. And strangely enough, you'll find opera houses in every small town across the entire United States. Even the small town of Mantorville, Minnesota, which population doesn't even really exceed 1,000 by that much. They have an opera house there, and it's made out of that wonderful limestone-sandstone mix that they just have there. Looking at the interior, though, you can see no decorative detail left untouched. And even looking at old pictures of previous performances, you have questionable things that occurred within the Symphony Hall. Were these true, or were these just some artist imagination? I'm not really sure. But you can still visit the Symphony Hall to this day and watch live performances, and I even had a colleague that had been there many times and oftentimes spoke of the beauty on the interior of the building, and I can see why. I certainly don't dispute that. looking at the balconies and even the decorative detailing around the stage. And it seems as though, once again, no detail left untouched, and it really sparks your imagination just looking at this. Well, let's look at the Boston Public Library. This is the McKim building in 1895. Now, it should be noted that Boston was known for having one of the first major public libraries in the United States, and this was the newer one that they built in 1895. So another late 19th century building, and we can see that, once again, they didn't spare any of the detail in the construction when they were putting it all up. Apparently, it was just so easy to do in the 19th century. And I know you keep saying that after a while, but you have to consider the fact that why aren't we building buildings like this today? Well, because it's just too expensive, and because we'll say it, we don't have the will to do it. There's too much government regulation, especially in the United States. Yes, government regulation. The answer for why we can do anything when it comes to conflict, but why we can do nothing when it comes to architectural achievement. The layout of the building is intriguing too from the aerial perspective because it gives the square layout as well. You also see some of the old statues. And of course here, what's really going on with the statue? I know they'll say it's a statue of science or statue of art or something along those lines, but it seems to paint a different picture. We also have a picture of our cornerstone laying ceremony, and that's oftentimes good enough for people. Well, they did the cornerstone laying ceremony, and it means we really built this building in the late 19th century. Why don't we do cornerstone laying ceremonies anymore? Well, I guess you'd call it a girder laying ceremony, or maybe a plastic ceremony. We have construction photos, and again, there's no problem with these construction photos, and I'm certainly not going to tell you what to think. But yeah, I guess I'm convinced that they built this library if you just believe these photos. Yes, another one. It's always amazing to me, though, the curious lack of activity, but I'm sure they just always came and shot these photos when it was a break day, especially when you look at the construction timelines on many of these buildings. I haven't really covered libraries as much in some of the other explorations, and given the reputation that Boston had with its library, I felt it fitting to include it in this exploration. One of the things I try to do is I try to cover different types of buildings in each of the cities because there's a reason why the city is known for that building, and I think that's one aspect in the official account that still gleans truth from whatever the original truth actually was. The entryway to this library is truly astounding. And when you look at some of the beauty and the detail that goes into it, and of course we have our friendly lions guarding the door again because, lions are just really awesome. MGM thinks so too. It also has a courtyard in the back of the library with the arches and the columns. And this just gives a reflection of one of these courtyards that you would expect to have a great time. And you can see why they would host weddings there. And remember what we said about weddings. You always know you're going to have a successful, long-lasting wedding if you get married in an old world building. Well, you can guarantee it's not going to last if you got, say, married at the current Boston City Hall. Your marriage would probably be over in about 5 to 6 months. Still, it's not easy to imagine why some would have that fairy tale image and getting married at the Boston Library. Looking at the main hall, though, this is just extraordinary when you look at how the layout of the ceiling is and all the decorative detailing in it. And you even have a little balcony over there. Sometimes you just get swept away when you look at the interiors of some of these buildings. And it amazes me how people can just pass through this every day, but I'm not judging anybody because that's what we're conditioned to do. We're conditioned to just walk right in and out of this every day and not really think twice of it. Now, there may be some people that can appreciate some of the artistic appeal in it, but when you really start to step back and look at it and appreciate it for what it is, you can't help but just be completely blown away for how they achieve this. And of course, you're not going to see any construction photos of erecting a single pillar or a column, or especially the ceiling here in this library, because why would anybody want to see that? That's just boring stuff. Just take pictures just showing some very generic things and bam, construction photo done, and I'm satisfied. And you may be too, and that's okay if you are. I'm still going to appreciate the building for what it is. Well, let's take a look at the Massachusetts State House, built in 1798. And this is an example of so-called federal architecture. Yes, we have another architectural type. And frequent viewer of the channels know that I'm a sucker for state capitals. And this is one of the oldest ones in the United States. And certainly preceded the Capitol in Washington, D.C., and most of the other state capitals. There's a lot of conflicting accounts with this, and we'll see that this state capital in Massachusetts is the victim of constant renovation. Why would you need to do any kind of renovation on a building such as this? And I always find these accounts for why we need to do renovation very conflicted and confusing, as they're no doubt intended to be. Look at the windows and the columns there. And once again, we'll see that while it may seem to be a somewhat more modest state capitol, once again, once you look in the interior, you find that that is not the case at all. You will see all the stunning architectural achievements of how they lay out, for example, this balcony and this rotunda here. And I mean, look at the ceiling up there. And then, of course, all the columns. And naturally, there'll be no pictures of the construction of erecting any columns. Also look closely at the gold dome here. Going back to the notion of lacking of pictures of columns, I think the only picture I've seen of building a column was that one from I think it was a civil courts building in St. Louis, where we saw that gentleman with a very precarious toehold as he was dangling hundreds of feet in the sky as a crane lifted the top of a column in place, supposedly. Once again, more columns on the inside of this state house, the state capitol. And of course, we see our familiar floor pattern because, maybe everybody just likes to play checkers or chess on the floor. Look, sometimes you have to have a little fun with these explorations. There's other older photos of the State House, and it certainly gives a different idea of what the original layout was. We're even told that the original copper dome on the Massachusetts State House was provided by a company from Paul Revere, of Paul Revere's fame. And it's also interesting to note that supposedly it was one of the churches that he stood up on a balcony when he saw the British were coming and then began his famous ride. Oh yes, this photo again. I'm always impressed by how they were able to do this stunning excavation of moving hills and mountains before we even had photography, and it was just that easy to do. I wonder what happened to that column or obelisk up there. Couple images of these Mount Vernon churches, because we're going to conclude with looking at one of the more extraordinary churches that I've seen. And we have looked at a lot of extraordinary churches, cathedrals, and basilica, especially with Vatican earlier in this week. But Boston is known for its many different churches, and you would think that there would be a very strong Catholic presence in Boston because Irish are always associated with Catholics. At least that's what the Know Nothing Party used to say. But now we'll look at the First Church of Christ, the Scientist, built 1904 to 1906. Now it should be noted that this is the extension. Christ the Scientist, another religion that just seemed to come up in the 19th century. And I always found that account very interesting because we're known of the tolerance of Americans in the 19th century. Of course, we're always told that's not the case, but, some people are tolerant, some people weren't. Perhaps that's the greatest truth of all. Another stunning religious edifice, and a religion that cropped up in the 19th century, and they managed to build this. Now, oddly enough, one of the first buildings of this religion that I looked up was actually in Wisconsin, although it really just looks like an old world house. It's interesting to note that there are several buildings on this entire compound, and they've really built this compound out. They have an original church that was built in the 1890s, and then they had this extension that they built in the early 20th century. And you'll see that these aren't just postcards or painted pictures. These are real images, and this is a building you can still go and visit to this day, which I think is very impressive. There's even one of these churches in Minnesota, and this, for some reason, reminds me of the church from Prince of Darkness, the John Carpenter film that we looked at about a month or so ago. This is stunning, though, looking at this extension, because this reminds me of the greatest basilicas that you see, and you can see the original church right there in front of it, and then, of course, we mix in some brutalist architecture on the right. And that just gives you a good contrast for how you can tell the differences. The interior of this church extension is stunning, with a very large arch and domes, and then, of course, we see the same details in the ceiling. And so different religions for different purposes building different buildings, but yet the buildings having many of the same architectural stylings. And of course the answer will be because all the architects worked together, they corresponded very well, and they all had the same know-how, and they all had the same financial resources. Yes, there is a lot of great decorative and gorgeous architecture that accompanies this church. And this is something else, another religion that started in the 19th century, able to achieve these stunning architectural achievements. And here you see the extension, which is on the left, and the original church, which is on the right. Again, another series of buildings that I would love to visit in person, and Boston is on my list. I haven't been there since... we won't say when the last time I was in Boston. It might give you a little too much information. But this is the original edifice that was built in the 1890s, and once again, we see a very stunning church made out of stone. And then looking at the overall extension. I just find it comical how they call that the extension. What's really going on there when you have what looks to be a mighty basilica from the Byzantine era? And then, of course, this is the rest of that entire compound, and they've added some lovely brutalist architecture buildings to it. Yes, is there really any comparison to it? And like I said, I'm fully accepting if you support brutalist architecture. So we go back to the tower, the custom house. The tower added to a building that was not designed for it. It means either the building was built with the tower originally, or this building is of a technology that is diminished. Really think about this. Think about what this custom house tower tells us. We could build a building that we could add a tower to that increased the height by a factor of 5, a factor of 6. Would you do that to a building today? What do you think about this? Let me know in the comments. And I don't want to try to direct you too much.